When I was younger, my father worked a part-time job cleaning the local theatre after shows. Occasionally he would let me tag along, and I would help him out for some extra allowance money. This building was built in 1916 and had been used as an auditorium and for formal dinners. Most areas/floors, 4 floors and a basement, had been blocked or converted off by the 90s. This theatre had 2 screens, a huge first floor screen and a small upstairs one. We worked alone in this locked building. One night I was sweeping up popcorn in the bottom cinema while my father cleaned the stairs going to the top floor. I got about 3 rows of seats cleaned when what sounded like a baby started crying at the bottom of the rows. This was very loud and distinct. I froze. It lasted about 10 seconds until I ran to my father. He looked and found nothing. It wasn't unusual for teenagers to try and sneak in for the night. On the last occasion I helped him, I was cleaning with my father in the small upstairs cinema. As soon as we walked through the door, something like a dark figure bolted for the fire exit around the corner, down a small hall. Those doors had alarms that were always set. This thing disappeared and didn't set off any alarms. Dad did a full search again, and nothing. I never went back to help him clean. My father said the theatre never bothered him, and whoever was there was just keeping him company. It probably helped that my father is deaf and never had to hear what I did. The theatre is called Bad Axe Theatre, if anyone is interested. I don't believe in ghosts or spirits now, but my 11 to 12-year-old self did not like that place. I was an infantryman in my time in the army. There was an occasion where we settled at an airfield that was about 1,500 meters away from where our new homes would be. There was this small abandoned community and an old British fort from the colonial days. The abandoned community still had dishes in the sink, clothes on the line, but everything was super old and deteriorating, like it had been left a year or so prior to our arrival. It hadn't even been looted, which is very unlike the area we were in. We had a platoon of MPs move into the biggest house in the abandoned community, which we will call Ghost Town. They moved out of this large house a week or so afterwards due to ghost children peeking through their windows and running through the house at night. They got no sleep and were terrorized, and finally got permission to move. They looked exhausted. When we got a new battalion commander who heard the rumors and was pissed that they wasted military resources and time moving because of some supposed ghosts, he said there was no paranormal activity, only enemy activity. He decided his infantry component would begin nightly patrols and set up ambush every night in the ghost town, on top of our already scheduled busy raids. Lucky us. One squad would go in at night and would start our patrols between 10 PM and midnight and would return just before the sun came up. The ghost town always seemed twice as dark as the areas around it. We could hear what sounded like kids playing on a playground at recess, but very faintly. Then we would be pelted with small rocks and the laughter would get louder. We were all pretty seasoned soldiers by that time. We had been in multiple firefights with casualties and deaths on both sides, but we were scared. We kept our night vision goggles on and brought our thermal sights, CLUs from the Javelin, but did not see anything. On my squad's 3rd or 4th patrol, we were walking along the streets in loose formation, very slowly, listening to the faint laughter and getting the pebbles thrown at us. One of our soldiers, Oliver, stopped in his tracks and said, "What the hell, dude?" Then he starts screaming, and he ran. I've seen Oliver shoot and kill an enemy at close range, and he sleeps like a baby at night. He is no slouch, but he lost his mind, ran away from the squad in a combat zone, and was heading back to the airfield at full sprint. He slowed down. Our sergeant caught up to him and tackled him, and began shaking him and slapping him, screaming at him to get it together. Here is what O said, when he could finally speak. He said that he saw a black shadow figure shaped like a man, with long arms and legs, that was walking about 10 feet to our side, along with us. When Oliver turned his head and saw him with his night vision goggles, the thing stopped and looked back. That's when he went crazy. It jumped and landed in a crouch and perched on the wall with its body facing us. When Ollie started screaming, its eyes flashed a bright light. He said it was red. I don't know how that could have happened through night vision goggles, and it leapt backwards off the wall and ran back into the night. We did not report any of this, and our sergeant, God bless him, did not take us back into the ghost town for patrols anymore. We would just hang out on the outskirts, and we would continue to hear the laughter at night until the day we left. When I was 9, I asked my dad for piano lessons. My dad was a professional musician, so he knew a pianist, and set up for me to start getting lessons. Scott was a good teacher, patient and compassionate. I learnt a lot. He was also a fun guy, and he would regularly have weekend bonfires and invite our family. So the adults could drink beer and play rock music, and the kids could roast marshmallows and run ourselves ragged on his property. My dad has 3 daughters, me the eldest, and was seeing a woman who also had 3 children. So every weekend there were 6 of us. Scott loved to play with us, and we thought he was the funnest guy for always taking time to hang out with us, all between about 5 and 12. He would let us dress up on him and pounce on him, and he loved to tickle us. You're seeing red flags go off now, but we didn't at the time. We liked that an adult thought we were fun. I have a cassette tape of us recording a fake news broadcast where he barges in for a tickle attack. I can't find a cassette player to listen to it, although I'm not sure if I want to. As I started to get a bit older, the oldest girl at 11 or 12, I started to notice Scott was showing me favoritism. He loved when I drew him pictures, liked having me on his lap, and when he took all the kids in turn a short ride around the block on his motorcycle, I got the longest ride. He took me all the way to a Target and bought me a dress that was way too short and showed off my legs. When we were sunbathing at a beach party once, I could feel him stare at me through his sunglasses. And here's the thing that creeps me out the most. Back then, I loved the attention. I was in constant competition with 5 other kids, the older rowdy teenage boys and the younger girls. I didn't cause any problems for my dad and his fiancée, so I didn't need any special attention. But Scott paid attention to me, and it made me feel mature and interesting. At some point, he and my dad drifted apart. The band got a new pianist, and we stopped going to his bonfires. I had already quit taking piano when I was 11, and started learning the clarinet instead. I didn't really think about it until a while after. Then one day, when I was 16, my dad called me and my sisters in for a family meeting. Scott was in jail. He had been arrested for having sex with a 12-year-old girl. He made her promise not to tell her parents, but she did. Dad said he had started to suspect that Scott wasn't someone he should have his family around when he brought me that short dress. Suddenly it all made sense. I didn't know how to feel. Nothing had happened to me, but he'd thought about it. Had I wanted him to think about me? Me, a 12-year-old girl desperate for adult approval. Was I actually surprised when I heard he'd been arrested. Now, as an adult, my sense of sexuality is pretty messed up, and I have little trust in people. I wonder what of this is related to him, if at all. Occasionally, I'm still devastated that someone I liked so much could have been thinking such evil things about me and my developing body. My family loves traveling. So about a year ago, my family took a trip to France. At this time, I'm a 9th grader and in high school. Before the trip, my mum spent a few months learning French, and my sisters had some basic knowledge of the language, so we were set. We flew into some country in Europe, and then took the train all the way to Paris. Once we arrived in the train station, we took a few minutes to prepare ourselves before heading out and looking for a taxi. We were walking when suddenly a guy comes up to us. He knew some English and asked if we were looking for a taxi, since he had a large van taxi. My family was happy, since we have over a 5-person family. There aren't really enough seats in a regular taxi. So we agreed, and we walked over with him as he points out a large black van, with another guy sitting in the driver's seat. Now that I think of it, there's no reason that there are 2 taxi drivers in a car. The weird part was that it had no taxi indicators or anything on the van, stating that this was a taxi service. I remember my parents exchanging glances with each other, but going along with it. So at this point we haven't even discussed the price or where we were heading. He just opened the rather large trunk and started chucking our bags inside. At this point, my mum was worried. She demanded an answer on why there was no taxi indicator. The man began switching between English and French and wasn't giving a clear answer. She didn't push it. And my mum then asked for the price. It was a bit costly, but there are no other regular taxi vans around. And at this point, the man is getting the last of our luggage in, when we noticed my dad's attitude change. He seemed more concerned. He went up to the man, stopped him putting the last piece of luggage in the van, and he said, "Show me your taxi license." At this time, I didn't even know there was a taxi license. I guess neither did the man. His eyes widened and he seemed nervous. In very broken English, he said something along the lines of, right, taxi license." He pretended to pat his pockets and acted like he left it at home. My parents at this point quickly grabbed the luggage and said thank you. We didn't need the taxi anymore. They quickly took us across the street and merged us into a large group of people getting away from the black van. We eventually found a taxi terminal and found a large van, and we never spoke of the event again. But I feel like I was that close to finding out whatever these people planned on doing with us. I worked at a movie theatre, and there have been tons of accounts of paranormal activity. A manager has told me about their experience with seeing a full apparition and having unexplained things happen to them while there. I started working there back in October, and the place has just been renovated, so the whole lobby and the auditoriums are completely redone. I've always been interested in the paranormal, and have never really experienced anything, but recently some things have happened that I just wanted to chalk down as a coincidence, but have made me feel really uneasy at the time. A couple of weeks into the job, I was closing with a couple of other people. When we close, we have to wait for all the showings to end, so we can go collect trays after the last showings. We have 4 huge auditoriums and 8 smaller ones, so we had just gone through one big auditorium, Theatre 3. It's got an eerie vibe compared to the other bigger ones, and a couple of us were just chatting in there while we waited for the next showings. I made mention of ghosts since they've been working there longer than me, and they told me a few stories. While we continued on about ghosts, a theatre light flickered. I didn't notice it, but they did, and told me. I just assumed they were pulling my leg. I was in the middle of mentioning some stories of a friend who previously worked there, when suddenly that light went out. We chuckled awkwardly, and I brushed it off as a coincidence. Well, fast forward to last week. I'm in Theatre 3 with one other guy who's been there for a while as well. Naturally, I want to see if he has any experiences, so I ask. We talk about it, and I begin mentioning the light going out in the theatre. We're at the very top seats closest to the ceiling, and there's a light right above me that happens to go out as we discuss it. I awkwardly laugh and say, "Guess this number 3 is haunted," but I can't shake that's a coincidence. A little later, I head to Theatre 6 alone, make sure it's empty and collect the trays. Theatre 6 is the theatre where the full apparition was seen. I'm walking across the last row, when suddenly the light above me goes dim. I glance around super quickly, and notice no other light is affected. I talk and laugh to myself, screw that, and I rush out of there. I felt so nervous after that. I'm just curious if anyone thinks that was paranormal in any way, or if I'm getting spooked too easily. This happened when I was 10 to 11 years old. I grew up in a fairly rural area outside of Raleigh. It was the nearest big city to us, and it took roughly 35 to 40 minutes to get anywhere good. Needless to say, when I was right around that age, the town we were in built a new library. Coming from an avid reading family, we were thrilled. On average, my mum, an older sister, and I would take 1 to 2 trips weekly to the library. It held a fascination for all of us. My older sister Babs used to come pick out a few books and spend the rest of her time on the computer, printing off fan fiction and stuff related to her favourite fandom. I spent the majority of my time in the young adult section and went through about 3 to 4 books a week. We were homeschooled, and therefore spent a lot of time reading and doing other stuff once our schoolwork was finished. Mum would always spend her time in the romance and non-fiction sections and grab a big stack of books and pick which ones she wanted by reading the first few pages of each. We knew the librarians, a lot of the regulars, and were in a very safe rural town in North Carolina. No reason to be on alert. The layout of the library was entirely open. Imagine a large high school gymnasium that an architect built with 3 high-story roofs and tons of natural light, and you had our library. You walk in and the checkout is immediately to your left, the young adult section and kids in front of that. Straight ahead is the computer bank. Then to the right are all of the adult books, fiction and non-fiction. Then around the entire edge were small activity rooms and reading/study rooms. This particular day was like normal. Babs went to get her couple of books, and Mum off to her section, and me to mine. Now I used to just sit on the floor and go through the books one by one, reading the jacket, then the first few pages to see if it caught my fancy. Super annoying habit that I don't have anymore. I remember being camped out on the second aisle closest to the door for a while, and then feeling like I was being watched. Keep in mind, I was in the young adult section. I didn't pay too much attention to it until I decided I had gotten through enough books on the shelf and I wanted to switch to the other side of the bookshelf. I stood up and walked to the other side, grabbed the couple of books I had chosen, and became aware of this dark-haired fellow at the end of the aisle, book in hand, not reading, but just watching me. It was like he was staring past the book and watching me. I didn't pay it much mind and moved to the next aisle over. A few moments later he followed. I figured that he was probably another teen and was looking for books. So I kept sitting on the floor and reading book jackets until he got closer. It all happened very quickly. When one moment I was reading book jackets, and then he moved to the same aisle as me. I brushed it off. I almost had enough books at that point to make it for my next library visit. Keep in mind, we had super old dial-up and one computer for 5 people in our house. My little sister was in daycare that day, and books were my joy and only entertainment, so I was very serious about reading. I guess I lost track of time, and when I looked up, he was still watching me. At that point, I got creeped out and had goosebumps. So what did 11-year-old me do? Try to find my big sister, of course. I tried to casually get up with my stack of books and exit the aisle. I had to pass by him to get to where the computers were. I tried to pretend I was interested in the top book on the stack. However, I caught his eye. That's when I realized he was probably in his late 20s or early 30s, and should not be in the young adult section of a library. I tried to find Babs, because she should have been where I left her at the computers. But lo and behold, she was not where I left her. This is pre us having cell phones. No one in the family had one except for Dad for work. So then I start to panic, because when I turned back to the young adults section, the dude was still there clocking me. I scan around and don't see my mother anywhere. I kept walking to the grown-up section and scanned down the aisles until I found my mum sitting in a corner in an armchair, reading. I beelined for her. Now my mum is probably the coolest cucumber on the planet. When my dad passed away, she called me and let me know he was in the ambulance and was not alive, but that I needed to come to the hospital. She also has never overreacted to anything in life before. Here comes severely panic-attacked me, trying to play it cool. I sat down at her feet and explained what transpired. She figured it was my overactive imagination and told me to stay close. Then, we talked about my book, or if we should go to Walmart or not this trip. Maybe Waffle House for lunch sounded better, or the Mexican restaurant in the shopping center Walmart was in. I was also very excited to get my Barbie a new set of dresses, because I had just received my allowance. We decided we would just get groceries at Walmart and eat at home. Now, whenever we did our library run, we would also hit Walmart for groceries and normal house supplies and the occasional toy. My grandparents used to give us an allowance every month for fun stuff. Mum and I were led back to the young adult section, and the guy was gone. Now, while she is calm, she isn't stupid. We found Babs sitting nearby to where we left her. Turns out she had been in the bathroom when I tried finding her. My mum explained what happened, and being much older than me, as she was closer to 20 at the time, she said it was creepy. But she didn't want to go to Walmart with us, so Mum and I should pick her up on our way back. She did give me a squeeze of the hand and a kiss on my cheek for comfort when I sat with her, so that was nice, and it made me feel safe. Mum then agreed. She and I checked out, got in the car, and went the 0.5 miles to Walmart. Now, I'm not saying this is safe, but it was a different time. I was a free spirit, and I roamed and my mother let me. I quickly forgot about the creepy guy once we got to Walmart, and got excited about spending some of the money allowance I had. A new outfit for my Barbies. The way our Walmart was set up, the toiletries and bath towels were across from the toys, so Mum was nearby getting shampoo and the like. She let me roam into the Barbie and doll aisle, which was very close. I turned the corner to the Barbies, and wham! There is the same dude from the library, standing next to the Barbie clothes. I froze. I basically was having a flip out before I realized I had to leave. He took several fast steps towards me and started to ask me if I liked Barbies, and I didn't say anything, but got really interested in something at the end of the aisle. I then, a few moments later, slunk away to find Mum and bolted. I ran and found her and explained he was here at Walmart. She left her cart. I followed. She moved so fast, she caught him at the end of the girls' toy aisle and asked if he liked messing with little girls, and that if he didn't stop she was calling the police on her phone, and held her hand over her pocket. Keep in mind we didn't have cell phones, but she had a beeper, so she clutched it in her pocket like a cell phone. The dude and her almost had a standoff before he finally held his hand up and got himself out. Now my mum has never in my life left a cart at a store, but she left that cart and she and I ran to our car, the dude nowhere to be seen, and drove to get Babs at the library. We didn't stop anywhere, but we got to our neighborhood, and my dad was working 5 states away on a contract, so we went to my landlord's house and told him what happened, and stayed there until he could go check out our trailer and the surrounding property, because we figured if this dude followed us to Walmart, he might follow us home. Nothing happened, but I sure as hell didn't read those books that week I got them. I had forgotten about this until recently. So dude who was stalking an 11-year-old, let's not meet again. I was military police in the Marine Corps. I have 3 experiences that come to mind. The first was on St. Patrick's Day 2011, a day that I was supposed to be off. My wife and I were getting ready to meet up with some friends when I got a call that I was being recalled and had to come into work to pull security on the flight line. Apparently no one else was answering their phones because I was the first one that arrived, even though I lived off base. Turns out that just before a training flight in a CH-53, a Marine had to go underneath to pull the pin out of the landing gear that allows it to retract, which is probably the most dangerous part of the whole process. The investigation ended up showing that there was a lack of scheduled maintenance done, so when he pulled the pin, it immediately collapsed on top of him. When I got there, they were just getting a crane in place to lift the helicopter up, and because I was standing right next to it, talking to the squadron CO, I had an up-close and personal view of what was left of his body. Now, intuitively, I know that he was killed instantly and could not have been alive for the half hour it took to get the helicopter off of him. But the sight of his half-crushed body, twitching, still gives me nightmares 7 years later. I ended up drinking a lot that night, and for many nights since. I've told this next one a few times before. The second one was during a health and safety check on a Marine that was in the process of separating from the service at the end of his contract. He was scheduled to be attending a week-long separations course that is supposed to teach you how to smoothly transition back into civilian life and help get your benefits set up. Like many things in the military, that separation course often was less important than doing your day job and supporting the mission. So people not showing up as scheduled was no cause for alarm. I was the patrol supervisor, working on a Friday afternoon sometime in August, when we got a call from the Marine Squadron, asking us to go check his room, because apparently he had never showed up the entire week for class. They had assumed he was where he was supposed to be, and the separation class assumed that he had to skip class and was at work. Remember, this was the middle of August in Southern California, in the infamously unluxurious Marine Corps barracks, where AC was something to look at, not that actually works. The way these barracks are laid out is there are 2 individual rooms with heavy metal doors with a shared common area and a bathroom, and then another heavy metal door to access the outside of the building. Turns out his roommate that was in the second room was on leave, otherwise we would have gotten a call a lot sooner. The moment we opened the first door, we knew what had happened to the guy. Sometime Sunday night or Monday morning, he had hung himself in his closet and then baked all week in the 95+ weather. A human body generates a lot of gases and fluid when it decomposes, which can violently leave the body if it is shifted or disturbed, like say by cutting it down while hanging. Let me tell you, death is a smell that does not wash out of clothes. We burn them all. The third isn't disturbing because of what I saw, but because we had found out that my wife was pregnant with our first child the day before. I was again working as the patrol supervisor, so when a call came in for an unresponsive child in base housing, it was given to me. I showed up a minute before the paramedics, and the guy that was home didn't seem at all distressed, more just defeated than annoyed. He takes me to the 4-month-old who is pale, barely breathing and completely unresponsive. Medical got on the scene, took a look at the kid and almost immediately loaded him onto the ambulance and headed to the hospital. Turns out, this piece of garbage human being was playing Call of Duty while his wife was at school and was annoyed and frustrated at his infant son for crying, so he shook him so hard that he severed his spinal cord, causing internal bleeding in the brain. The baby died the next morning in the hospital. He also had a 2-year-old son that was upstairs playing and asked us where they were taking his brother. The father was sentenced to 20 years in prison for voluntary manslaughter and 2 counts of child abuse, causing great bodily injury. These are my older brother's experiences. He used to work at a movie theatre about 2 to 3 years ago, when he was about 23 or so. This theatre was large and stood out in our tiny Oregon coast town. My brother Alex was going to work there to get extra money, along with my mother's friend Jill, who was a manager at the time. He started out in janitorial work late at night, to the early hours of the morning. At first it was a pain to him. He hated getting up for the graveyard shifts, but the weird stuff that kept happening meant he would keep going back. One night he was on bathroom duty, just as Jill left to take another worker home, leaving him by himself. As he was cleaning a stall, he could hear someone's footsteps enter the bathroom, to slowly go into the stall next to him and lock the door. He quickly got up to check the stall next to him, which swung open easily with one yank, and no one was in the stall. Needless to say, he got out of the bathroom faster than a bat out of hell, and waited a good 30 minutes in the candies room to calm down. Even other workers had complained of weird things happening, such as people walking behind them, breathing on their necks, whispering, touching, and things moving in the projection room. Even workers before them reported the hydraulic doors slamming and lights flickering. Apparently, last janitors that worked there made the spirit angry enough that he would manifest in the storage rooms or in reflections, scaring them. To make the workplace a little less scary, Alex's friend Stacy decided to nickname the spirit Bob. Pretty nice name. Not even kidding. He shook the door at her when she named him. Now Bob was an interesting fellow. As the months and hauntings continued, my brother noticed a pattern with him. His favorite theater rooms were 3 and 6, where horror movies played. He realized they might be his favorites because he was able to feed off the fear the moviegoers would feel. This was one of the best theories he could come up with, which actually makes sense. Bob also had a sense of humor. Bad humor. In the theater there was a place that the employees would call the ghost hall, which is a long concrete hallway used as an emergency exit. But other than that, never really had a purpose. On my brother's end shift, where he would have to lock up and set up the security system, Bob would leave the door at the end of the ghost hallway open, wait for my brother to notice on the security cameras, wait for him to go and try to close it, and then slam it, leaving him in the dark with at least 20 feet of darkness above and 10 feet of darkness around. He never successfully locked him out of the theater, but started to take a liking to him. He was worried if it was demonic at one point, where he would request a light off at will and have it shut off. He quit his job a while ago, but that still doesn't stop him from seeing Bob moving around the projection window. Amazing and creepy. I live in Chicago and don't have a car since public transportation is so much easier. I went to a gig at some bar. After it was done, I headed home. My friends and I were all taking different rail lines home, so we said goodbye and parted ways. After walking for a bit, I realized how late it was, and it hit me that the bus I was taking wasn't a late night bus and didn't run past midnight. So I saw a taxi go by with its lights on, and I'd just gotten paid. So I thought, what the heck? I usually don't take taxis because they're so expensive, but I was tired and wanted to get home. The guy stopped without waving my hand, which I thought was weird, but he probably saw me and thought I needed a ride, right? I hop in and he asks me where I'm going. I tell him my neighborhood and he heads in that direction. I also didn't tell him where I lived exactly, but gave him the main intersection closest to me. As we started getting closer, he starts asking about my tattoos and piercings. Whatever, I get asked a lot about them, so I just said where I got them done. He then asks me if I have my more discreet areas pierced, and I tell him no, and asks me if I want to get a drink with him. I inform him I have a boyfriend, and he begins begging me. By this point, we're about to pull up to the intersection near my apartment, and I basically tell him no thanks, but thanks, and then he pulls over in a parking lot and won't unlock the door. I look at him and he says, "The only way you're getting out of here is if we grab a drink." Then he gives me a sinister smirk. I'm practically crapping myself at this point. I'm freaking out and my phone's dead, so I couldn't even call anyone. I don't know how I thought of this, but I said, "Okay, we can grab some beer and hang at my place." I tell him to pull into a 7-Eleven and I can buy us the beer. I get out and tell him that I'll be right back. He watched me the whole time I walked through the parking lot. I go in and act as if I'm asking the cashier to open the cooler for me, but instead, I'm saying, "Hey, this taxi driver is crazy. Help me. I live not too far from this 7-Eleven, and I know this cashier by name." He takes me into the back and walks me out the back door and walks me to the back alley away from my apartment, and then has one of his co-workers keep an eye on the guy until I get back safely. I got home, thanked the cashier a million times, and he said he was happy to help, and told me to keep my door locked and that he'd try to get the guy's license plate number. The dude left by the time the cashier got back though, and I haven't taken a cab since and don't plan to again. I'm a junior, so this was either 10 or 11 years ago, back in either 2nd or 1st grade, before I moved across the city I had lived in at the time, though I remained at the same school. So when I was a little kid in elementary school, I would always take the bus with my friend Addie. We aren't such close friends now and grew apart towards middle school, but we were good friends in elementary school, with her being the first person I ever met at school. Our bus driver seemed like a pretty friendly guy. I don't remember much more than a face, as most of the time on the bus I was prioritized with my dolls that I would occasionally carry around with me, or my friends, or with whatever else a kindergartner or 1st or 2nd grader has to be preoccupied with. But the driver acted differently towards Addie than I, or anyone else for that matter. For our birthdays, he would sing happy birthday and get the other kids on the bus onto it. How he even knew our birthdays I'm not sure, but we were kids, and someone probably got excited and said something. He also always referred to Addie and I as princess. It wasn't like some people call every female they meet darling or sweetheart, or other terms of endearment or pet names. It was just us two, and maybe 1 or 2 others that he would say this to. We were little kids. We didn't see anything wrong in this being treated differently. We come to find out a couple of years later, when I was in middle school, that he'd actually been fired and arrested. My old bus driver was in prison for trying to keep a girl, one of the middle schoolers, from getting off the bus, and she'd had to yell out the window or call someone. I'm not sure of the details. Either way, he was in prison for trying to hold a girl against her will, and thinking back on how he treated my friend and I have no doubts he eventually tried something similar with us if he'd have gotten the chance. Not to mention that it was creepy in general to single out 2 young girls and treat them in that way. This story takes place in the 60s to 70s, as this happened during the Vietnam War. For those of you who don't know, the Vietnam War was a war where the US was fighting Vietnam, or Viet Cong as it was sometimes called. Basically, the war was over a communist North Vietnam against the democratic South Vietnam. This war happened almost after the Korean War took place. Basically, it was the same reason for Korea, except the Korean peninsula was split between, guess what, a communist North and a democratic South, which to this day the war is still ongoing, but there hasn't been very much fighting thanks to a truce signed, which I know will be broken sooner or later thanks to what's happening now. Anyway, now you people who've taken your history classes obviously know why I'm mentioning the Korean War, but some of you probably don't. So, this has to do with my story. My family has fought in conflicts from World War II, the War on Terror. Unlike World War I, where most of the fighting was in Europe and Africa, World War II actually had threats from all over the world, but the biggest threats were Europe, the Pacific, and Africa. Countries like the UK, USA, France, and the Soviet Union were Allied powers, while countries like Nazi Germany, the Italian fascist state, and the Empire of Japan were the Axis power. So after Germany invaded France, Japan saw this as a chance to invade some of France's territories in the Pacific. And of course, one French colony was Vietnam, Thailand, and Cambodia, but back then known as French Indonesia. One man saw that France was treating the Vietnamese horribly and decided to start a rebellion after World War II. The US saw this as an opportunity to support their own ally and sent some men, as women were only allowed to serve as nurses back then. Then one day the Vietnamese attacked an American naval ship off the coast, to which the president at the time was allowed to respond after that attack by At first, having planes fly over and bomb the Vietnamese, soon eventually turning into full-out war between each other. My grandfather was one of those men to join, and his father cleaned up what I think was the nuke that dropped on Hiroshima. So he wanted to fight communism, and was about to head on a plane, but eventually received word that his wife was having a kid, my uncle. He went AWOL, let's just say. The military didn't let him leave, but he forced himself to quit the war. And honestly, I'm thankful that he did, because what he heard next would have meant that I wouldn't be here telling you this story. His plane, the plane that he was just about to head on, was just down by the Vietnamese. And guess how many people survived? 0. I used to work at a movie theatre. Last night I was closing and had my first real paranormal experience. Around midday, we had to take care of cleaning a big theatre. It was theatre number 1, and it was one of the bigger ones. It was just me and 2 of my co-workers cleaning it. Now this auditorium was pretty dark during cleaning, because it had less lights on because some had burnt out, and maintenance hadn't had a chance to change them. We were all in there basically in the dark, and I did something a bit ballsy. Being a skeptic, I thought it would be funny to jokingly call out to a ghost to show itself. "Why is this ghost so lame and not showing itself?" I said out loud to my co-workers. One of them was new, like me, and the other one was laughing but said, "Nah, don't joke like that." So I apologized to the ghost and laughed it off, because I was still skeptical. As we were cleaning, the conversation suddenly died, and I heard the familiar buzz of a seat reclining in the theatre. I looked up from my broom and all around to notice my co-workers were doing the same. I was expecting to see one joking about, but we were all equally confused. There was no one in the theatre but us, but the sounds persisted for a few more seconds until they stopped. We began talking again to brush off the nerves, and a few times through the conversation we overheard it again from a few other directions. We just talked through it and ignored it. That same day, it was already past closing time. The people cleaning with me had left already, and I was stuck with the closing shift alone. The few people there were workers in the concession area, and the few customers in the theatres watching movies. I had to change the soap in the restroom dispensers, so I went in, as I knew I was alone in the restroom. The stall at the very end of the restroom we keep locked, because, at the moment, the toilet is broken. I'm changing the dispenser closest to said stall, and I get this odd feeling. Then I heard the locked door start to rattle and bang, as if someone was in the stall. I freak out and loudly say, "Screw that," and rush out. I walk over to concessions while looking back at the restroom and get a co-worker to go in there with me. He checks the stalls and sees it's locked and empty, but there's no one in there but us. There's no way some breeze could have banged a door like that. It was May 19th of this year, my birthday. Me and my mum were just leaving a music gig from a coffee shop, and my mum decided that she'd rather us take a lift than the bus, because the buses around here are extremely dangerous at night, with all of the drunk people and people with guns who start a fight. We've never had a bad or strange Uber or Lyft experience before this one. Neither of us were expecting this to happen, especially in the part of the city we were in, because it's not the bad side. The lift came, and it didn't come up to the coffee shop, though it kind of parked in the dark street where it was hard to see. We weren't sure why he did that, but whatever. We got in, and everything seemed fine. We thought we were on our way home, but it turns out that we were very close to being taken. We both noticed that he was taking a weird route at first, that turned into him not even going in the direction of our town. Note, the address he put in the GPS was on his phone, and it was our home address, but he wasn't following it. We asked him, "What are you doing? Where are you going? You're supposed to go on the highway." He wouldn't respond, and kept his eyes on the road the whole time. My mum tried to tap him on the shoulder. Nothing. The only thing he said to us the whole ride was, "You're going to Andover, right?" We both simultaneously screamed, "No," and he laughed. But it wasn't just a chuckle in a malicious laugh. He was indeed going to Andover, and that was not the city we put in for the address. It's 30 miles away from where we live. He was getting further and further away from our town, and we began to panic even more. My mum called the police, begging them to send a cop car or to do something to stop this man, and they said, "We can't do anything." "Are you kidding me?" my mum said. "We're being taken somewhere by a stranger, and who knows what his intentions are." The operator must not have been taking my mum seriously or something. The operator just kept saying they couldn't do anything about it, and that was it. But they said to stay on the line until we were safe. What if we never were safe in the end though? It sounds like they weren't going to do anything unless this man harmed us or said something violent. They didn't care one bit. As we were almost in Andover, the Lyft driver changed his mind and apparently turned the car around and went back to our town. He still wasn't speaking to us. Me and my mum were still scared the whole time, even after we arrived to our house. I'm pretty sure that I saw a firearm sticking out of his pocket. Both me and my mum are very wary about Lyft and Uber, and we take extra precautions now when we use that service. Army Base, Soest, West Germany. A still, dark autumn evening. It must have been warm, because it was the kind of temperature you don't notice. Me, 13, and a mate, 15, just dossing around before we had to go in. Behind the flats where we live was a green area with a play area. Only one street lamp, so it was very dark compared to our street, and the well-lit main route through the camp, which was about 80 to 100 meters away from where we were walking. No traffic, nothing. It was never busy, and this was on a weekend evening, so literally no traffic and no one out, and was about as far as we could tell, which suited two teenagers just fine. So we're heading between our respective block of flats, and in the darkened park area we stopped dead. On the main road, moving right to left, was a figure, vaguely person-shaped, but undulating and waving like a cloth underwater. It glided along the middle of the road. Based on what it obscured behind it as it moved, I'd estimate it was between 8 to 10 foot, but at the very least it was larger than your average-sized man. This shape, this thing, was not walking. There was none of this slight up and down motion of walking. It just glided smoothly and as fast as walking pace, and it was all black. Not someone wearing black clothes, it was a hole cut into the night. No reflections, no shadows, just blackness. It seemed like a lifetime as I soaked this detail up, when in reality, it couldn't have been more than 2 to 3 seconds. I whispered to him, "Do you see that?" "Yeah," he replied. And then the thing changed direction towards us. The last image I have before we broke and ran was of it rising up as it came over the curb. This is what makes it real for me. This thing had some kind of mass that at least obeyed some laws of our physical world. It moved from the brightly lit road into the same darkness in which we stood. We broke and ran for our lives, back onto our street and into my mate's block. The guy bolted back to his own home, leaving me wondering how the hell I was going to get to my own. After a while, the fear of the repercussions from my dad for being late overrode my fear of what might be out there in the night. So I ran, eyes straight ahead, the 10 or so meters to my own front door. I was in too much trouble for being late to ever say anything when I got home. Sometimes when I'm walking and the night is warm and still and quiet, I think about it, and I wonder what I'll do if I ever saw it again. Run away, or face it down, and perhaps solve a 30-year-old mystery. Honestly, I don't know. This happened about 6 to 7 years ago, in 2011 or 12, over the course of about 5 to 6 months. I never really got the courage to tell this story, and it haunts me. I was around 12 at the time, and of course lived with my parents. We had moved out of the city 2 years prior, and just settled in this little town. It was tranquil. We were in a really secluded area, and my closest neighbours were around 500 meters away, which for France, Brittany, is not uncommon. I was going to the local middle school about a 10-minute bus ride away, and between my house and the bus stop there's about 1 kilometer on foot of distance. Just know that to get to my house from the bus stop there are 4 roads. One was long and went by a dangerous road. Another was a tad shorter and creepy. The third was the longest way through the woods, and the fourth was the easiest and fastest way. I used to always use the 4th road, and then one day, as I was turning, there was someone I had never seen before. He was around 18 at the time, maybe older. He yelled at me and waited for me to turn, and followed me. And at some point, I just stopped and asked him to go away, as I wasn't sure he was a neighbor. He told me that he had been paid to sexually assault me, and that if I ever told this, he'd kill me and my family, showing me a big knife. Now, to 12 to 13-year-old me, it was really scary. I ran, went inside, locked all the doors, and waited until my parents returned at 6:30. It was during the first half of October, and every day since then I saw him waiting for me at that specific turn, so I just went the other roads to go home. It lasted a few months. At some point he'd find me, so I'd change paths. One day he attacked me. I ran for my life as he tried to stab me. I managed to get away, but I lost a bra and shirt. I told my parents on the first day it all happened and they didn't believe me. But after the attack we went to the police, and I learnt that I wasn't the only one who was attacked. He hadn't killed anyone, but he had sexually assaulted a few girls. He was mentally ill and was released 3 years ago from prison. I heard from another victim that had been attacked 2 years after me that he was thrown in jail, and I'm honestly relieved that it won't happen to anyone ever again. I'm an 18-year-old female, a student, and from where I'm from, July is an exam period for everyone, so I drag my backpack everywhere. It was 7 AM, and my exam was going to start at 9 AM, so I decided to call an Uber and get there early, because I live at least an hour away from the exam center. The car arrives on time, and I go in now, and I'm not the type to judge someone with a glance, but for some reason, the driver of the vehicle made me feel extremely uneasy. He was in his mid-40s. He had dark circles around his eyes and was smirking a lot. He was silent for a good 10 minutes, and then he started asking me questions. He asked if I was a student. I didn't want to answer, thinking he would try to hit on me, so I just lied and told him I was a proctor, hoping that he would back off. God, how wrong I was. He started to smirk and tell me he would always cheat on his exams, that I was a mean person for ruining people's lives. I don't know why I did this, but I chuckled at his comment, and this probably triggered him to thinking I was liking this. My bad. He then started to get personal and asked me how old I was and if I would let my kid cheat. I lied, told him I was 34 and that I had a 16-year-old kid. Mind you, I look pretty damn old, I'm overweight and don't have the best genetics. I hoped this would drive him off since I was old and had a kid, but he got creepier. He then told me I looked like a strict person and if I had a whip in my backpack. Then he asked if my husband was strict like me, and I told him that he was stricter, hoping to make him sound like a dude who doesn't want to be messed with. That did shut him up for a while, until I noticed he was moving to a completely different region. Now, I'm not a map expert, but I know the exam center could not be reached with that route. I started to panic, but was afraid he would do something if I confronted him, since we were in the middle of a rural area. So I decided I would receive a fake phone call from my coworker and pretended to talk and tell her that I was in the Uber and that we would be there soon. And I shit you not, when he heard it, his car turned around and went in the direction we came from. He continued to make flirty jokes until this happened, and I swear this turned my blood cold. As we were approaching the center, he told me that I should catch someone cheating, come back with him, and let him drive them so he can make extra money after that, and he would take me to my address. The creepy part is that he had studied it by heart. He was looking me into the eyes and made it sound like he knew where I lived. I still remember the mark he drove was a blue Nissan. If I ever need an Uber again and get stuck with a blue Nissan, I'll cancel it no matter what. I didn't call the company because I'm afraid that he'll come after me since he knows my address. I just don't want to be associated with him by anything. So creepy Uber guy, please, let's not meet again. In my previous journeys to Arizona, I explored all the natural wonders, like the Grand Canyon, Superstition Mountain, the Painted Desert. My grandfather had an obsession with the Old West, cowboys and spaghetti westerns. He was so determined to go to Tombstone to see the OK Corral, so we went to Tombstone. Mind you, I'm a guy who can be viewed as a sensitive. To describe the trip in words, it was a strange one. So we arrived at Tombstone at around 10 in the morning. We do our tourist things, old-timey photos, try on weird hats, try their old beers, and look at the pictures. After a few hours, we decided to go to the old theatre. This place was not very big, 2 stories high. A lady is standing in front of it, saying that there are tours of the theatre starting at $10 a person. So we go in. This theatre is one of those that has a poker room on the bottom floor, top floor with blankets blocking off some small rooms for the prostitution and a stage. Me being me, I decided to go ahead of the tour. I went to see what's ahead by myself. I saw 2 steps that led up to a very small room with a piano to the left, a wall of photos to the right, and the thing that I didn't notice at the very center was an old hearse with a casket in it, with a portrait of someone who had been transported to their final resting place. I'm not moving, mind you. I'm standing as still as a telephone pole. The casket inside is closed. Every muscle wants to leave, but my mind wasn't working with my body. I see the casket lid lift up and then close. I was completely alone and don't remember leaving the room, but I did, and then was back with the rest of the group. It was a freaky experience. In March of 1996, I was the age of 16 and joined the British Army. When you joined the armed forces in the UK, you started with 10 weeks of basic training. As I was going to be an army chef, I attended Pirbright training camp for what I thought would be the worst part of army training. I couldn't be more wrong. Now, back then, I was super fit and very happy-go-lucky. I took to the training, even though it was incredibly tough, horrible accommodation, bad food, and run ragged from 4 AM till 9 PM every single day. But I got through it and passed. I still remember my passing out parade, and how proud my mum was watching me in my uniform marching around. After you finish the hell of boot camp, you go on to phase 2, which is your trade training, which, depending on what you choose, would decide on where you went. For me as a chef, was St. Omer Barracks in Aldershot. However, until your phase 2 training started, everyone, no matter the trade, went to Deep Cut Barracks, a delightful camp about a mile from Pirbright, so only down the road. Initially, I was very excited to be leaving basic training. After all, the food was better, you could have duvets on your bed, and the regime was nowhere near as strict as Pirbright. When you arrived, you were all put into a new arrivals building, sharing a room with 10 others until they decided to which platoon you went to. I assume on the length of time, you would be there too. So I settled in for my first night. I knew a few of my roommates from the training platoon. My very first night on camp, I caught a glimpse into the realities of what Deep Cut was. I woke at about 1 AM needing to use the bathroom. Upon getting to the door, before I could open it, 2 guys in gas masks carrying pillowcases barged through the door. They ran straight into the far bed and proceeded to batter the lad sleeping in bed, with what looked like from the outline, helmets in their pillowcases. After watching this stunned, I thought I should get help, and it was then that I noticed the corporal who was in charge of us that night was holding the door open for the 2 guys. He was hammered and in hysterics at what was unfolding. The assault lasted for probably 30 seconds before they ran out, followed by the CPL at the door, and I could hear them pissing themselves with laughter as they ran down the stairs. After helping the battered lad to the bathroom, I watched him clean himself up. Neither of us said anything. After all, he looked about my age, 16. What could we do if one of the people in charge was involved in this? In the next few days, I came to realize this camp was basically where sergeants, corporals and officers went if they had failed in their career or for a punishment. What better people to look after than 200 to 300 young impressionable soldiers, all between the ages of 16 to early 20s. They got drunk and did things to us for their own amusement. I had the hope and knowledge it would be okay. You normally spend 1 or at most 2 weeks here, and we would be out soon. Day 3. I got called into the sergeant's office. He explained, due to the fact that they are so short of army chefs, no one wanted to be a heroic army chef, so they were critically short. I had to wait at Deep Cut for enough chefs to pass basic training before going on to my next phase. After asking how long, 3 months was the reply. 3 months at this hellhole? I thought it couldn't get any worse. I was very, very wrong. At this stage, I got introduced to my platoon while I was at Deep Cut by my brand new platoon sergeant, G. Initially, he sounded very friendly and spoke with a soft Sunderland accent. He started by laying down ground rules and cleaning. It was at this point he warned us about his evil twin. We all laughed, but he wasn't joking. He said that if we came across his twin, it wouldn't end well, and left us with that. After speaking to a few of the lads that had been there a week or so, they reiterated the warnings along with the "do not get on Sergeant G's radar. Just keep your head down." It was at this point I began hearing rumors of the suicide of a soldier and the involvement of Sergeant G. Apparently, he had made this soldier the target of his evil twin and made his life an utter misery, tormenting him whenever he could. It was a few days after that I personally witnessed the evil twin in action. Myself and a few lads were in our room when a pigeon flew in through the open window. After several hilarious attempts to shoo the bird out, we failed, and the pigeon carried on flying around and landing on lockers. This is when Sergeant G enters the room and asks what's going on. After explaining about the pigeon, "I will show you how to catch him," he says, then proceeded to jump from bed to bed in the air in an attempt to catch the bird. At first, this was hilarious, and we were all laughing, even Sergeant G. That is until it went on for at least half an hour. He didn't stop. He was relentless. The poor pigeon probably was scared to death at this point, and got himself caught by Sergeant G. Now what happened next, you might think is complete bull, but I can 100% swear to you that I will always remember this moment. Sergeant G puts the pigeon's head in his mouth and bites it clean off. Then he spits the head out onto one of the beds and threw the body out the window. Stunned by this, we just stood there, while the dementing Sergeant G kept saying, "Evil Ed's had his dinner," and laughing. While this is probably the most psychotic event I witnessed, the sheer cruelty of Sergeant G was legendary. One day in the height of summer, he made us push a huge temporary road around a field barehanded. If you have never seen one of these, it's basically a gigantic roll of rubber and steel. Being jet black and being in the sun all day, this thing was incredibly hot. So hot, in fact, all of our palms and fingers turned into one huge blister on each hand. After inspecting the damage done to our ravaged hands, he shouted at us for not having men's hands, even to the women. Not satisfied with this, he ordered us to grab a huge rope from the back of a Land Rover and ordered us to have a tug of war with it with this rough strip of rope until all the blisters tore off our hands. The pain of the raw flesh of our hands was incredible, especially when he ordered us to do press-ups on the hot concrete afterwards. There was also the time the booster injections they gave everyone became infected in a few of us. Sergeant G's evil twin made it his mission to find who had an infected booster site and would punch them in the site as hard as he could. To this day, I still carry the scar after he exploded my infected injection. Then of course, made me do press-ups after all the pus and blood poured down my arm. He would do things like hide under beds, like a real-life bogeyman, waiting to see if anyone would dare talk about him, or he would hide in unlocked or empty lockers and do the same. The man was a lunatic for sure. While at Deep Cut, time went slowly. It was boring, All we had to do was whatever the delightful training staff could dream up for us. One day, the lieutenant in charge announced we were going on exercise for 2 nights and 3 days in the woods around Sandhurst. On the morning of the exercise, Sergeant G gathered everyone on parade and got everyone organized and announced on the exercise some of his SAS mates might make an appearance and interrogate people during it. I didn't think much of it, as he was always giving us veiled threats. The exercise didn't start off that badly. The weather during the first day was gorgeous, very sunny, and for some reason they didn't take an opportunity to make us do some running with kit on in the sun. That night, we settled into guard duty. To explain, you and your basher mate, basher being a hole dug in the ground that you sleep in, will take a stag duty, which lasts for about an hour. The guard duty itself involves you lying down in a camouflaged hole dug especially for the guard duty. Then one of you will go next to the basher and tell them it's their turn, and so on. At the end of our turn, I went to the next basher and whispered it's their turn to stag on. A low voice with what sounded like a Scottish accent came from the shelter aggressively telling me to go away. I didn't recognize the voice and thought to myself, maybe the SAS thing is true. Maybe I can be a hero and capture Sergeant G's mates. Imagining what Sergeant G's face would be like in the morning when I reported that I single-handedly repelled the SAS attack, I cocked my SA-80 with a blank round and demanded whoever it is to show themselves. Silence. Angrily, I pulled back the poncho covering the basher, to be greeted with what I could just see in the dark as Sergeant G's naked body. He was in the basher, shagging one of the female recruits, and must have put on a weird fake voice to throw me off. I stood, stunned, as a furious, naked Sergeant G leapt to his feet, telling me to not say a word about this and to get back on guard duty. I couldn't quite see how angry he was because it was dark, but I could hear the fury in his voice. I was now on his radar. He was married, and I now was a witness to him screwing some woman whilst on exercise, and I knew he would have to do something about this. The next morning, things seemed to be okay. Sergeant G didn't even acknowledge me, which suited me down to the ground, as the exercise carried on until the night. The weather this night wasn't like the night before. It was torrential, and I was assigned the 3rd stag duty, which was around 1 if I recall correctly. Now, weirdly, I was told I had to stag with the girl who Sergeant G was with last night, which was odd, as it meant my basher mate didn't have to do guard duty. Not sure why, but I wasn't suspicious about this sudden change, and we carried on with the guard duty, chatting in low voices, bored out of our minds as the rain hammered the waterproof material above, and all of a sudden, a tremendous weight crashed through our canopy right onto my back. Someone from behind grabbed the front of my helmet, and I could feel what felt to be a knife against my throat. Pulling my helmet tighter backwards, it felt like someone headbutting or hitting the back of my helmet with something, and he demanded I drop my rifle in the same Scottish accent I heard the night before. Pulling me to my feet, he ushered me forward in the dark forest. Glancing down, and I caught a glimpse of the girl I was on guard duty with, and could see how terrified she was when we locked eyes for a moment. Then she carried on laying down with her hands behind her helmet. I remember stumbling through the woods for about 10 minutes in the pitch darkness. Then a voice ordered me to lie face down on the ground. Dropping down in what was a huge muddy puddle, I tried to keep my head up and face away from inches deep of foul muddy water, The voice then demanded my name, rank, and number, which I gave him. He replied he didn't believe me, and he would shove my head into the puddle with what I assumed was his foot. Daring to look up slightly, I could see 2 pairs of boots, so I knew it was the sergeant, and probably one of the corporals, as the other one didn't speak at all. They then started asking about how many people were in our platoon, and who was in charge, to which I obviously gave them all they wanted to know, being 16 and terrified of being alone in the woods with what I knew was Sergeant G, and I didn't want to make him angry. This of course had the opposite effect. He gave me what felt like a punt right in the balls as hard as he could. The pain from this was excruciating. I felt like I wanted to throw up. Every instinct was to curl up into the fetal position, but they wouldn't allow me to. This carried on for a further 20 to 25 minutes, with them asking me things like how great Sergeant G was, or other corporals in the platoon, to whom was the biggest slag in the platoon. No matter what answer I gave, it was met with violence, like kicks to the ribs, my fingers trodden upon, and at one point I felt a thin stick whipping the back of my thighs. Thankfully they got bored, and realized they couldn't carry on doing this without doing me serious damage, and was ordered to my feet and led back to the area our platoon was camped out, and told to go ahead alone when fairly close. After retrieving my rifle from the girl who was still on stag duty, she asked what happened. I always remember this, as I didn't want to seem like a coward. I told her nothing had happened, and they just asked me questions. However, I was crying inside. All I wanted to do was to go home to my mum. Pathetic as that sounds, but I felt violated. The next morning was the end of the exercise. Sergeant G gathered everyone. After some debriefing, mainly about how bad we had done, and then announced that his mates from the SAS reported that they had interrogated a few people, while staring at me the whole time. The whole march back, all I could think of was how he was going to get me. Now everyone knew what he was like, and without a doubt, I would be targeted by him. Now the misery was unbearable. I wanted the march to last longer, because at least everyone was present and he couldn't single me out. We got back to camp, and everyone set about cleaning their gear. When I was told the officer wanted to see me, my heart leapt, thinking maybe the girl had reported what had happened, and this would be my saviour, and in a way it was. The officer informed me that there were enough people to form a training troop at St. Omer, passing out from Pirbright, so I would be leaving at the end of the week. Thankfully, I managed to avoid Sergeant G for the whole week. I volunteered to set up the field for RLC Day, and was under the supervision of a different sergeant. So that's my epic tale of the deep cut barracks. As mentioned at the start, I tried to let the tribunal know of what occurred, and they didn't want to know. This man affected me in such a way that I still have recurring nightmares, that I have rejoined the army, and he is going to get his revenge. And as for Sergeant G, don't worry about him, boys and girls. He got his just desserts for all the years of torment he doled out to vulnerable young soldiers. The army recognized this and promoted him. He is now the officer in charge of recruit welfare in the British Army. I wish this was a lie, but it's not. The following experience happened to me over the course of 1999 to 2000. I was 13. My dad had taken up a new hobby, local auctions. We lived in the sticks of South Central Pennsylvania. The Mason-Dixie line was almost my backyard. The spattering of towns around us we lived in were very small, mostly just huge expanses of farmland, cornfields, and lots of general run-down old barns. There were 2 major auctions locally, Stoner's auction on Sunday and Weller's auction on Tuesday evenings. I was going through puberty kind of early and was very angsty and emotionally dramatic. The previous year I'd had my first boyfriend, but his parents didn't approve of the relationship and forbade us from seeing each other. Somehow it worked. The only tie I had with him was that my dad had told me he spotted him at Wheelie's one Tuesday night, when I wasn't there. From then on, I never missed Wheelie's. I always held out hope I'd see him again, but sadly never did. As a teenager, I always had a notebook and a pen on me, and I would go places just to write in my journal, not paying attention to anything around me. This habit eventually led to me getting kicked out of our church's youth group, but that's another story for another time. Many of the nights, Dad and I would go to Whirlies. My younger sister would come along and would run around and play, sometimes going a little too far off from the crowds. She remembers this particular individual that I am about to describe too. One night, I noticed an elderly man with very deep, caring eyes. I can still picture his face so clearly. He smiled and winked at me, and I guess in my hormonal confusion, I felt a bit of thrill at the attention, and maybe the second time, possibly the third time. But one night I felt someone brush my arse, more than just what you'd expect from someone walking by in close quarters behind you. More of an open-handed slide across my butt. I remember I was wearing this ridiculous biking outfit that I had bought in Walmart. It was silky, and I was getting a lot of compliments from the boys when I wore it. The feeling of that hand totally sliding across the silky fabric of my pants stands out so clearly in my memory. Another night, I was sitting there writing in my notebook, and he walked by and nudged my pen. It made me mess up what I was writing and look up. He winked at me. There was this really sad look of longing in his eyes. I still felt like this was just some weird old guy, no one to be afraid of. There were so many weird old men at this place, as long as I stayed near to my dad. But when he showed up at the other auction, Stoner's on Sunday, I was a little shaken. I wanted to say a little time had passed. I remember I was all fancied up in my awkward glitter makeup and rebellious outfit, and I was sitting there writing in my journal next to my little sister, when I felt a little tap on my shoulder. I turned around, and he was there, sitting right behind me. There was an expanse of open seats, and it was very clear he didn't just happen to be sitting there. He had definitely come over to talk to me. "How can I get to know you better?" he said in a controlled, barely audible voice. At this point, I'm almost positive that I said, "Well, I don't think what you want to know. I'm only 13 years old." Looking back, that makes sense, because after waiting a little while and saying it again, I ignore him and he left. Maybe my saying that aloud was enough to make him feel like others might take notice. It really scares me to think about my little sister sitting beside me hearing all of this. She had absolutely zero awareness of keeping herself away from strangers, and I told her not to go to the bathroom or anywhere without me that day. That might have been the day he told me his name, Wilma. I saw Wilma one more time. It was a Tuesday night. It was in the late summer and was so hot. The auction was packed. My dad had to park his car way off the main area, sort of up in a wooded spot on the property. It was not directly visible to the auction goers. So me being an annoyed brat after begging to go with him, I asked my dad if I could go up to the car. I wanted to listen to my Walkman and drink my Mountain Dew and write. It wasn't as hot as where the car was, and my dad gave me the keys. I saw Wilma one more time. It was a Tuesday night. It was in the late summer and was so hot. The auction was very packed. My dad had to park the car way off in the main area, sort of up in a wooded spot on the property. It was not directly visible to the auction goers, so me being an annoyed brat after begging to go with him, I asked my dad if I could go up to the car. I wanted to listen to my Walkman and drink my Mountain Dew and write. It wasn't as hot where the car was. My dad gave me the keys. I must have asked him when he was in the middle of bidding on something, because I did not know if he would allow me to do this if he thought about it for 1 second. I had kept him informed about Wilma, you see. I remember sitting in the 1998 Oldsmobile Cutlass Sierra with the windows rolled all the way down. I hadn't seen Wilma in the crowd, so I wasn't concerned about safety. Suddenly, I heard knocking through the music of my headphones. I pulled them off quickly, and Wilma was standing right at the window on the driver's side, sticking his head out the window. "Hot enough for you?" he said, not worried about controlling his voice as no one was near. I did what made the most sense, almost on autopilot. I got out of the car as fast as I could. I stood there and yelled, "Why do you keep following me?" I'm sure my voice was loud enough that someone could have easily heard. He was immediately unnerved. "What do you mean, follow you? I've been coming to these auctions for years," he said, his voice suddenly back to the quiet monotone. I could not believe he had literally leaned his upper body into the car, and despite being very naive, I knew this was completely inappropriate. I said in a loud voice, "Listen, you're making me very uncomfortable, sir. I'm going to get my dad." I didn't move, but I had my dad's huge keyring in my hand. I briefly considered worst-case scenarios and stuck my middle finger into the ring. I could maybe hit him as hard as I could with the keys in my fist. This man then started running, not walking at a brisk pace like most elderly men do. I mean running down the little embankment. I went to get my dad and pulled him aside to tell him what happened. He told me he'd take care of it, and started looking through the crowd for Wilma. He was gone. That night I cried and panicked all night long, terrified every time the phone rang or that there was a noise outside the house. I figured if he wanted to, he could find where I lived, and I stopped going to the auctions, and my dad says he never saw Wilma after that night. He wasn't lying either when he said he had been going to those auctions for years. It was odd that he stopped going to both of them so abruptly, but then again, not. Okay, so a little backstory first. I lived in Thailand from ages 13 to 17 as a missionary kid. My parents never really let me travel by myself unless it was necessary. We didn't have a car or anything, so I would rely on public transport. Being a young blonde white girl in Thailand, I usually wasn't traveling by myself anyway. On this particular occasion, I was out at a mall with some friends, and I was going to go home. It was around dusk, and so I was going to take a taxi. I've taken taxis before, and haven't had any weird experiences until this time. When I get in, the guy was asking me questions like where I'm from or what my parents do. They usually ask these sort of things because I speak the language a bit, and they're curious like anyone else would be. But this guy begins asking me very personal questions. How old I am, if I have a boyfriend, if my parents are home. I immediately start to become uncomfortable. I gave him a false name and age, saying that my parents were home. And this is not where it stops. His questions continue. He's now smiling creepily at me in the rearview mirror, and I ignore him and just look out of the window. After a minute of silence, he starts to hum, not just humming to himself, but stares at me from the mirror. I wait a few more minutes and have my phone in my hand ready to call someone if he makes a different turn, as I knew most of the paths to my house, so I would know if he were to take a wrong turn. I also start memorizing his taxi number, colour, and what his face looked like. He eventually starts full-on singing to me a slow song that I couldn't understand. I finally call my parents and just say to stay on the phone with me. The guy realizes I'm on the phone at this point, stops immediately, and doesn't look back for the rest of the trip. I told him to drop me off a block away from my house, just so he wouldn't know where I lived. I've never gotten out of the cab so fast. I realized he could have been harmless and not intending to be creepy, with his singing and his other stuff, but it was weird, and I was not going to take any chances. I just want to preface this by saying the following actually happened. I've been lucky enough to have a few paranormal experiences in my life, and this happens to be one of those instances. When I graduated college, I moved back home into that weird post-grad limbo where I get a real job and try to figure out what I want to do with the rest of my life. In the meantime, I wanted one last summer of procrastination before I jumped into the real world, so I asked my friend to hook me up with a job at the local movie theatre. He had worked there for a couple of summers during school as a morning cleaner, running a shift from 4 AM to 10 AM every morning. It wasn't a great job, but it paid more than minimum wage, which was pretty hard to come by in a town oversaturated with college kids. I interviewed and got the job when I was highly recommended by my friend. The guy who interviewed me would also be my manager, a scruffy guy named Jeff. He smoked like a chimney and made tank tops and cut-off jeans a solid part of the wardrobe. He also looked like he hadn't had a good night of sleep in years, but that could have also been all the hard drinking he did every night. I remember he asked me the typical questions: if I was okay with working weird hours, cleaning up vomit, etc. I had worked in fast food as a teenager, so none of that stuff had bothered me. What struck me as odd was the last question he asked. Do you scare easy? I kinda laughed and said no. He shrugged and said, well, some new hires get kind of spooked by these big buildings at night. You know how it is. Big building. It makes all kind of noises. Makes sense to me. I have a very active imagination, but I had a hard time being scared in a movie theatre of all places. I started my new job the next day. For the first few weeks, everything was pretty normal. The job was actually pretty easy. All things considered, throw this away, mop that, scrub this, wipe that, take out the garbage. You're by yourself the majority of the shift. We were allowed to bring our iPods with us. The theatre was fairly large. Its layout was shaped like a T, with the lobby and bathrooms in the stem. The smaller theatres on the left and the larger IMAX screens on the right. Running above the theatre hallway was the projection area, an equally long hallway with a couple of small offices and all of the projector equipment. If you were the first to arrive in the morning, you had to go up a winding staircase and turn on the lights in all the theatres. It wasn't a big deal, except with all the lights off, the building can be, as Jeff once described it, a little creepy. The projector area was full of promotional material, including a sea of cardboard cutouts from all the movies they have playing in the theatre. Sometimes, the theatre manager would have giveaways, and staff could take home some of the items. Pretty cool, but when the lights were off, it looked like a sea of people in the hallway. Another part of our job was to meet with the day crew after our shift at 10 AM and go over any maintenance problems we were dealing with, and they could highlight anything we needed to address on our next shift. The second thing to strike me as odd was the day manager, Bob, pulling me aside after my shift. "You're the new guy, right?" he asked. "Yes," and he put a pair of keys into my hand. "Can you make sure this place is locked up at night? I know you guys are usually in the back or upstairs. I don't want anyone sneaking in while you're occupied." I asked him if that was a problem. He looked a little flustered and went on to explain that customers, primarily women, were complaining about a tall, lanky man in a suit that had been following several of them from theatre to theatre, sometimes into the bathroom. The last several months, several frightened women had come to the front desk, describing a 7-foot-tall man in a black suit, complete with bowler cap, walking slowly after them. A few times, even the police were called. Teenagers that worked the day shift referred to him as the tall man. While he primarily targeted women, occasionally a male co-worker would catch a glimpse of him, sneaking into a theatre. On a couple of occasions, they would pursue, thinking it was someone trying to sneak into a movie, only to find nobody there. We had 12 theatre rooms in total, but Theatre 5 was the worst. Nobody wanted to clean it out when I first started. I was fairly naive about what was going on, and didn't understand why Jeff was so apprehensive about Theatre 5, and kept assigning me to clean it out. What made Theatre 5 unique was that it was sat behind the bathrooms in the lobby, so to get to the sitting area, you had to walk down a long hallway before reaching the screening room. Being that far back, you were the most secluded, especially when it's 4 a.m. and the only other people you are with are on the other side of the building. People cleaning there would complain of nosebleeds, constant headaches, and a feeling of being watched. My first supernatural experience took place here. Theatre 5 always gave me an uneasy feeling, like I was being watched. On multiple occasions, I would take out my earbuds and shout, "Hello?" into the empty theatre. Of course, there would be no response, and I would shake it off and just go back to my routine. One day, I was sweeping out garbage from under the seats when I hear footsteps. Someone running. I look down at the front of the theatre, and I catch a glimpse of a little blonde-haired boy turning the corner into the long hallway. Immediately, I threw down my broom and chased after him. I ran down the hallway and out into the lobby, where the kid had disappeared. I walked further into the lobby and saw my boss outside the front entrance on a smoke break. "Who was that kid?" I asked. Jeff looked at me for a moment. He was confused, but then he laughed. I'll never forget how casually he said it. "Oh, so you met Charlie?" Charlie was another entity customers complained about. On several occasions, they claimed a little blonde-haired boy was running up and down the aisles in the theatre, causing all kinds of noise and ruckus during the movie. Of course, it was in Theatre 5. When an usher would come to apprehend the child, he'd be gone. The female staff affectionately named him Charlie, after his resemblance to the character in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Charlie was also responsible for knocking several cans of garbage over, throwing paper around, misplacing things, and making our janitorial duties a pain in the ass. Charlie wasn't frightening, just more of a nuisance than anything. We used to theorize that he was the son of the tall man, but these two were never seen together. It took that experience for Jeff to admit that some people have seen and heard some things, which was his way of saying that the theatre was haunted. I found it odd, considering the theatre was relatively new. It was built in the 90s, on some wetlands. According to some people that lived in the area, The property was owned by a family who sold it off back in the 1980s. There was no evidence of foul play. It wasn't an Indian burial ground. It was just a weird place where strange things happened. I didn't even realize there was a basement until my 3rd or 4th week. The basement, as I was told, was primarily used for storage. I'd give you a better description, but that's as much as I know considering the one time I was asked to go down there. I didn't even know where the hell it was. It was a Thursday, and I was ready to get out of there. I remember that I had the next couple of days off, and I was ready to relax a little bit when I got home. I still had plenty of time on my shift, but this particular morning, I was really dragging ass. Jeff gave me a couple of bags and told me to drop them off in the basement. I said I didn't know where it was, and he pointed down the hall. Last door on the left, marked employees only, he replied. I started walking away, and he stopped me. Don't go down there by yourself, he added, with a bit of hesitation. There's a lot of stuff down there, and I don't want you tripping over anything. There were usually only 3 of us working a shift. This morning it was Jeff, myself, and a co-worker named Trevor. Trevor was on the other side of the building cleaning out a theatre. I could hear his leaf blower running. Yeah, we use leaf blowers to blow the popcorn out the theatre. I didn't want to bother walking across the building to grab him. I figured I'm an adult, and I can drop a few bags in the room for Christ's sakes. Jeff walks out the lobby to have a smoke, and Trevor is down at the other end of the building. I'm by myself, at the far end of a dark hallway. I open the door, and I'm looking at a long staircase that drops into the darkness. I flip the light switch to my left, and there's a light at the bottom of the staircase. It's flickering. Of course it's flickering. Nobody ever went down there to fix it. I heard a door open from the lobby. Jeff hadn't returned. I'm just hearing things. I look back down the staircase that I'm about to descend, where I hear a voice from the bottom of the steps. Hey. It's a low, raspy voice, and I pause. Hey, come here, it says again. There's a shadow bleeding in from the bottom of the staircase. I can't tell what it is, but it's definitely a person. Hello? I call down. I don't know why I did. I know that I'm the only person on this side of the building. I know that there isn't just some person hiding out in a dark basement. At this point, my heart is pounding, and I'm starting to sweat, because I know this isn't normal, and I'm experiencing something that shouldn't be happening. You gotta see this. Come here and look, it says again. The voice is a little louder. It sounds scratchy, like someone with a cold. The shadow is bleeding further into the bottom of the steps. Whatever's down there is coming closer. I toss the bag down to the bottom of the steps, turn off the light, and walk back down to the lobby. Jeff is walking back inside, reeking of cigarettes. I tell him about what happened. He has a look on his face that tells me this isn't the first time something like this has occurred. He almost looks irritated when I tell him I was going to go by myself. Nothing here's gonna hurt you, he said finally. I will never not be shocked at how casual he was about the whole thing. I think I was more taken aback by Jeff's reaction than I was by the actual incident. Later on, I told Trevor about what had happened. We went back to the steps to investigate, and when I turned on the flickering lights, the bags I had thrown down were gone. Theatre 5 had its instances, and the basement was particularly scary. But nothing was quite as bad as my experiences with the projector area. Around 6 a.m., we would take a 30-minute break. Jeff and Trevor would usually go to McDonald's to eat, but it was always too early for me, so I'd lay in the hall and listen to my iPod. No matter how loudly I turned up the music, I could never cancel out the sound of the footsteps from the projector area. It sounded like a 300-pound lineback, sprinting back and forth. Heavy, loud thumps up and down the hall above me. I told Jeff about it once, and he remarked that it was just the building settling, and there was a lot of equipment upstairs making all sorts of noise. Jeff wasn't the smartest guy, but that didn't stop him from insulting anyone else's intelligence. Maybe he was trying to keep me from quitting. The turnover rate was pretty intense at the theatre for cleaning staff, and the creepiness was a big factor. The pay was pretty garbage too, but that's a whole other story. So it wasn't before long I started feeling apprehensive about going upstairs to check the projectors and turn on the lights in the theatres below. On one particular occasion, I was walking up the steps to the hallway, and I heard what sounded like a child call my name from the bottom of the steps. I knew it was Charlie, because how many children are in the theatre at 4 a.m? That was the first real instance of hearing my name. For a week straight, I'd hear voices echoing down the hall from the projector room, Theatre 5, or down the hall. That was easy to ignore once I put my iPod on, but it never shook the feeling of being watched. I'd never seen the tall man in person. I had only ever heard instances where I encountered Charlie, heard noises or saw shadows. My only experience with it was at the start of my shift, when I was the first to arrive at work. If you're first, it's your job to go upstairs and turn on the theatre lights in the projector hall. I wasn't happy about it, but it looked like it was going to be another morning where Jeff and Trevor were late, and I didn't want to mess up my shift by waiting around. Since the projector area is dark, typically, we'd carry a flashlight with us while going around flipping switches. That morning, I couldn't find the flashlight. We'd later find it in the garbage. Charlie's fault. So I walked through the dark hallway of the projectors, flipping all the switches. I had stayed up all night prior watching the Andy Griffith Show. I remember because I was whistling the theme song to myself as I walked down the corridor. Once again, I got that feeling of being watched, and something several yards away in the area with the projectors overlooking the IMAX theatre was staring back at me. I stopped whistling and tried to focus my eyes. It was a cardboard cutout. They were everywhere, so I kind of dismissed it and was about to flip the next switch when the cutout moved. I froze. What I thought was a cutout was actually a figure hunched over. It was quietly whistling the Andy Griffith theme song, imitating me, only whistling slowly. It slowly rose up from its crouch, revealing itself to be at least 7 feet tall. It was a man. All I could see was a silhouette against the red exit sign lights and some of the projector computer monitors. It started towards me, whistling quietly. I wanted to move, but for some reason my feet were cemented in the spot, and I had cotton for a tongue. I didn't know what to do. Slowly the tall man stepped towards me. He walked with a bit of a waddle, as if he had a limp in his left leg. I couldn't exactly tell. He had taken about 3 or 4 steps towards me when something caught his attention, and he turned and walked into an office down the hall. I turned back and ran down the steps and waited outside the theatre until my boss and the rest of the crew arrived. I told them what had happened, and they explained that the tall man existed, but he wasn't going to hurt me. I didn't care. I put in my 2 weeks and haven't looked back. Sure, there were tons of famous and some not so famous, or more infamous, skirmishes and battles for the South. This small piece of hilly terrain in somewhere eastern Kentucky butted us right into the mountain crevasse, and the elements were hell. 3 pairs of socks at least every 6 hours, or you could lose your toes to the black. Frostbite, famine, and of course the enemy made our lives hell. Our supply line had been broken miles back, and ammo was becoming scarce, and I witnessed men fastening their bayonets in lieu of what was surely to come. The air was quiet, the morning thick with dew and mist, whence even the squirrels had retreated this ominous morning. Every man knew it. No scuttlebutt prep talk from any sergeant was going to shake the fear from these men. The Yanks waited, only beyond the trees and the gully that they currently formed in, probably breaking fast and applying their wares of dare and terror. Oh God, the waiting, the long, tiring on edge, like a worm on a hook waiting. When dawn could give a little more, the drums and artillery started the barrage. Dirt, trees, and men flew willy-nilly into the ditches and saplings surrounding us in the tight gully. We struggled valiantly to bring our muzzles around and plant aim for just one enemy. The cyclones of impacted mortar fire churned the dirt relentlessly, making visibility near zero at times. I crawled to the parabola of the ditch, feeling exposed, and indeed so. Nonetheless, I saw one, a Union soldier running full speed, bayonet fastened, and leveled as he charged our embankment. I brought the old muzzleloader around, remembered my breathing as a shell exploded at what seemed to be only feet from my right, throwing me clear, and no longer did I see the charging soldier. Now I had problems. Well, one problem. My right leg was mangled. The artillery shell had done its job, and mobility was now impossible. Grasping the rifle and its one shot close to his chest, he reached for the loose bayonet and managed to attach it upon the end of his rifle, and not a second too soon. Suddenly, perhaps, even the tenacious Union officer had preserved and dived over the Foxhill embankment, with murder and hate in his eyes. Also, there was a little fear. If I remember correctly, I raised my rifle in reflexive terror. That did not mimic any form of training he had received. This was brutal survival. The bayonet pierced into the diving officer's exposed chest, his own bayonet plunging into the dirt inches from the Southie. Out of raw fear and reflex, as the officer plunged, gravity his nemesis, the Southie shot the rifle's payload. Surprisingly, considering the early damp conditions, the rifle bucked its flint, and with a deafening kaboom, created an exit wound in the officer the size of a watermelon. The enemy was dead, but his leg was beginning to succumb to shock, and there they were to pull him back from the lines. The general or colonel of the southern unit was able to break the back of the northern hastily invading forces, allowing many southern casualties to be brought back behind the lines for medical treatment. For all his lucid happiness to be alive and rescued, the trip was painful, and no laudanum nor liquor was spared for his pain. He lay in a row of patients in order of trauma and need. He was third, if the doctor didn't break for potatoes, a smoke, or a much-needed rest. No one wants to wait. No one is in a hurry. And no one wants a tired, cranky doctor to amputate their body parts. Yet he knew that was exactly what was coming. The nondescript pile of sawed-off, bloody appendages, still wearing their uniforms, piled as high as a man behind the surgical tent. And oh God, the smell. So putrid. The flies, and it seemed like Pestilence's waiting room. And so it was. The surgeon sat on an old stump, scarfing down a dry sandwich with bloodied hands. Besmirched in a bloody apron, not very unlike a butcher back home. His hair was thinning, and his brows were generous, but cruel or perhaps just jaded. He was large and overweight, but he carried his weight like an asset rather than a liability. An orderly stopped and quickly whispered something into his ear as he polished off the sad sandwich, and he nodded and stood to stretch to his full monotonous size. Maybe he just seemed so big from down here. They came and got A1. Now I'm second in line, and I really want to keep my foot. I pray for the first time in 3 months as artillery shells exploded in the distance. An old veteran, sometime in the night, left a small whittled crutch beneath my slumbering shoulder. I woke up, and I was next. The orderly declared the wound, the most likely form of treatment, and desperately shot me a small weak smile telling me, "You're gonna be okay, friend." They lifted the litter, and towards that house of horrors I was brought. The surgeon did not look rested or in good spirits. I tensed immediately, causing my pain to nearly and blessedly take me away from this. Alas, it did not. I glanced at the tray of barely washed blood-soaked instruments and used towels. I retched. Then I saw the bone saw. Within a second, I had been deposited on an operating gurney quite unceremoniously, followed by an emotionless, "Sorry, buddy." I glanced and gazed about, but it was all they had said, and it was worse. Screams, missing portions of living men, and so much blood. Dry blood, floor-soaking puddles and stains everywhere. This was a true charnel house. Within moments, several orderlies insisting they were trying to help me held me down. I was powerless. Even through the excruciating pain, he couldn't muster an inch of wiggle room. And the reason for this was unfortunately visible. The butcher stepped in, drying his hands on a dry, blood-stained towel, and immediately sized up the menacing bone saw from the soaking bucket. "What do we got here? Another limb?" the surgeon muttered as he struck a match and lit a stub of an old cigar. "Yes, sir, doctor. Right lower extremity. No chance of saving the foot, sir," the nurse responded. "Okay, let's take a look." The surgeon grimaced and nodded his head. "Let's do this. Hold him down. A good one this time," the surgeon said with exasperation. Oh God, he's going to cut off my foot, and I can't protest nor stop him. I'm pinned like claustrophobia, buried alive, unable to move. And then it begins. The first cut just saws the flesh right into the sinew and nerve clusters. The doctor dictated as he worked on me, as if I wanted to hear this. But even more so was the grind each time he would saw into the mangled leg bone. How deep was he at this point? Surely just 1 or 2 more passes of the saw and the worst would be over, if the infection didn't kill him. Then, a horror more terrible than he could have ever imagined. The surgeon, in order to avoid a major artery, had to resaw an inch higher to ensure the patient's lack of blood loss and possible survival. After the mistake was overheard, and the third sawing grind with the dull bone saw, the Southey found sweet solace in unconsciousness. When he woke, the first thought Beyond the speed of pain was the thought that mere yards away, his leg and foot sat indiscriminately on a massive pile of appendages, ready for the flames of tomorrow and the next set of casualties. He closed his eyes, thanked someone for the bottle of opium, and cried as he fell into sweet, warm, addictive safety. Sometime later he awoke to the fever, and then the tent flaps blustered with the cold Kentucky air. Through the burlap he heard thanks being given to the local pig butcher for helping out with the casualties. I thought I smelled a faint odor of a chewed cigar. I used to go to church. Well, I still do. Just rarely now that I've seen more opinions and all of that. Some background. I have cerebral palsy that limits my motor functions, and it messes up my leg muscles. I've been through 2 surgeries, so I know how odd it feels to be pitied. I can walk just fine, with and without AFOs. Anyway, I went to a church with my dad, my stepmom, my sister, and my older stepsister. I call it Church of the Corn because I don't want to bring the rest of the church down for this isolated incident by calling it its real name. To say that they were enthusiastic about worship was kind of an understatement, but that's not the point. The point is that the youth pastor and my sister didn't really get along while I got along with him. I wouldn't say that we were friends, but one of the things he did still makes me actively stay away from people in the church during service to this day. One night, when it was just me and my sister, we just hang out with our church friends. Some of them are still part of this new youth group that's much more bearable and less getting traumatized by seeing the scene in the Passion of Jesus getting nailed to the cross. Cut to me, sitting in the front row with my friends being reserved and quiet, because I didn't like to talk much in service, even though I used to think at the time about how bullshit this all was. Now I was zoning out, and he was talking about the usual stuff you hear in an evangelical church, when all of a sudden, I feel his hand on my knee. "I want this boy to run, jump, and walk," the youth pastor said. It took my mind a second to register what was going on. I'm usually a physical person. I love hugs and being hugged, handshakes and other physical displays of affection, but I didn't really trust this guy. I froze as he continued, and I felt like he was using me further in his agenda. After service, I ran immediately to my sister, who saw it all, and decided to do this, and I love her for it. She had me do some jumps and run around, and that made me feel good. I ran around the sanctuary and soon forgot the uncomfortable feeling. Every time I see him, I never feel good, and I was out of there shortly after. This happened to my father when I was a young girl, in the early or mid-90s. My dad was in pretty good shape, about 5'10", and in his mid-40s. He had a fairly high-up government job that frequently took him to Mexico. This particular trip had him working in Mexico City. One night, he and a co-worker went out to dinner in a kind of touristy area I think was called Zona Rosa. They went to a few bars after dinner, enjoyed the city, and decided to take a taxi back to their hotel. When they were in the taxi, it stopped at a red light. There was a police car waiting in line behind them. Suddenly, 2 men from the street ran up to the taxi, and the driver let them in. They attacked my dad and his friend and demanded their money and jewelry. Now, my dad was pretty strong, so when he started kicking these men, it probably did some damage. That's when the men started stabbing him with rusty screwdrivers they had for weapons. His pants were tattered and bloody from all the wounds. Meanwhile, the police behind them, who had a clear view of what was happening, did absolutely nothing. And the taxi sped off with everyone still inside. The attackers take both of their wallets, watches, and wedding rings. Now the men are angry because there isn't much cash. They drive around the city hitting my dad and his co-worker over and over, while demanding the PIN numbers for their credit cards. My dad's co-worker, who spoke Spanish, kept trying to tell them they didn't have PIN numbers, but this just made them angrier. They had no idea what these men had planned for them, as they just drove them around and around the city. Finally, they stopped in an unfamiliar location next to an 18-wheeler. The men dragged my father and his friend out, and told them to crawl all the way underneath the truck. Then both men jumped back into the taxi and sped away, leaving my dad and his friend stranded in a sketchy part of town with no money. Eventually they got yet another taxi, and went back to the hotel. My dad immediately packed his things and took the next flight home. I remember him sitting at our kitchen table looking so pale and disheveled. I'd never seen him like that before. His wounds weren't too serious, but he needed a tetanus shot and ended up going to counseling. Despite what happened, my dad didn't let this experience scare him away from going back to Mexico City. He was brave and continued to travel there for work until his retirement. He says that it could have happened to anyone in any city, but it's still one of the scariest things that has happened to my family. I've been serving in the US military for 6 years and have seen some odd things. Back in 2014, at some federal land east of Fort Bragg, I was driving a buddy back from a used car dealership. This is a small 2-lane road deep in the thick, tall, dark forests protected by the DoD. It was about a 2-hour drive. We noticed our phones and the radio didn't work during the return trip, even though it worked on our way to the dealership. But we figured sometimes signals are weak due to weather, even though it was only slightly overcast. Not long after, we realized this. A blinking red thing flew over the road only 19 feet above my car. No noise, not shaped like anything we knew, and it was just blinking red lights all over in random spots and all different sizes, and it was moving at about 60 miles an hour. There was just enough glow from the sky of the setting sun that we could sort of make out its silhouette, which was not consistently shaped. It was a rather organic, blobby-shaped thing, as if it was a mashy glob of food someone had thrown in the air. We weren't freaked out about it, just mentioned it as kind of like, huh? That's weird. 2014, Fort Bragg. Another incident. I was in the very back storage room of the building that I worked at. I was inventory at the time. It was only me and the senior NCO in the other side of the building this early in the morning, and I had the door shut behind me in this small, windowless, ventless storage room. I was standing with my back to the door, which was the only door, and had a clipboard in my hands that I was looking down at. I then noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. When I looked up, I saw a single paper carefully slide itself from one part of the desk to another, with no explainable force acting upon it. It even went from being flush with the smooth oak table surface to climbing up to a stack of papers to be on top, all without the corners or edges folding up as it made this 2-foot cross country. I then stared at the desk for another 2 lifetimes and booked the hell out of that room. A few years later, 2017, Fort Bragg. My roommate and I are in our barrack room. It's a quiet Saturday morning, and we're both up in bed with our phones. Suddenly we hear the card key lock on our door beep, and the little monitor inside open the lock. Our heads jerk to the door as we see the handle turn by itself, and the door pushes all the way open, revealing no one standing there. We tried to explain it off, to no possible explanation. Even if some kind of rogue radio signal or electrical short malfunctioned our card key lock, just right to make it unlock on its own. It does not have the ability to turn the doorknob and pull the bolt out of the door frame, or even push the door open. It's also a very tough door, and gets kind of wedged in its frame, so a fully grown soldier like my roommate and I had to shoulder round the door while turning the knob to enter, so there's no possible way the door could have just swung open due to wind or air pressure. We have a window on both sides of the door, with the blinds drawn and daylight outside, and saw no one approach or leave the door from either side. We are on the 4th floor, and our hallway is an exposed balcony. Finally, the only people who have a card key that can open the door other than my roommate or I is the Master Sergeant of the barracks, but he lives off post miles away, isn't on the base on weekends, and the card key is inside a locked box that needs to be signed out at the brigade. 2 years later, Syria. I'm trying to get some sleep in my tent, but there is this strange howling / aggressive panting and growling which sounds like it's coming from the sky above us. I go outside into the pitch black, with only the fully starry sky above in a thrown-on uniform at 3 AM, only to find a couple of other soldiers smoking and also looking around. It sounded like crying, angry talking, an animal panting and growling, and the noises just circled us for 30 minutes. Sometimes it sounded like it was right over my head. I pointed my flashlight in the air, swept the sky with night vision goggles, and never found out what it was. It hasn't happened before that, and hasn't happened since. The next day everyone was talking and complaining about it. The Special Forces guys who have been out there for years say it's the jinn, a type of being in Muslim lore. It's the only explanation that I can't disprove. Later on, still in Syria, I went outside looking for my buddy, and I saw a shadow standing a few feet away in a place he'd normally wait for me. This silhouette even moved and put its hands on its hips like it was impatiently waiting as I was running up to it. As I neared him, he walked around the corner. I come up to the corner 1 second later, and there's no one there. I was naive, sheltered, and only 14. So one day I went on this chat site, because I remember I was having a hard time falling asleep, and it was like really late into the night. I thought talking to some strangers might help me drowse off. Anyway, I was on there for maybe 15 minutes when I got a PM. I remember his name to this day. It was like Loving Dad or Lovely Dad, something like that. He introduces himself and says, "Hi," and asks for my information. I tell him my real age and my last name, and I remember we were talking about Disney movies. Nothing creepy, and he was funny. So I felt like maybe he was a good guy, but I was so wrong. So we ended up innocently talking for about an hour. Never did I think to ask him his age. I don't think I even really cared. But I was finally getting sleepy and told him I had to go to bed. But he really wanted to stay in contact with me, and I didn't see why not. After all, we'd spent an entire hour just talking about movies, and he knew a great deal about them, so I thought he was my age. I give him my Skype, and for the next week we continued chatting. We both cammed, and then I saw how old he was. He told me he was 30, but I didn't think much of it. A little weird, but I never thought it was inappropriate. And he wasn't an ugly guy, and I was 14, and thought I was being an adult by talking to this older, more mature man. But then it got weird. I remember I went on vacation for a few days, and when I got back and started talking to him again, the conversation would lead to more sexual topics. He would say something like, "You have such red lips. I would love to kiss them." I didn't know how to react, so I just giggled. But then he started to ask me if I would call him Dad. I told him something stupid like, "I already have a dad." And he would say things like, "But I would love you more." So at that point, red flags started to pop up. After that eerie comment, I told him I was getting sleepy. I logged off, and the next morning, I deleted him. This happened 5 years ago, when I was about 15 and not very smart. I was still in school, and back then I lived in a small apartment complex with about 4 or 5 apartments in 2 stories, with my mother, brother, and sister. That day, I wanted to go somewhere, and my mum didn't let me. So later that day at about 8 p.m, my mother and brother took my sister to the hospital, as she was feeling a little bit unwell. Me being the rebellious teenager I was, I got dressed and went out. It's appropriate to mention that my apartment was right by a branch off the main street, so the only thing separating the building was a fence. Inside the fence, there were some parked cars and big trees. So I walk out of the house and walk a little further ahead to a taxi stop, and I did. The minute I saw the driver, I was creeped out immediately. He was so creepy and had an unsettling vibe to him. We negotiated on the price, and I tried to bid higher so he could refuse me and leave. When he persisted, I told him I changed my mind and wasn't going. I headed back to my apartment building, and I was surprised when I looked back and he started to follow me. I was scared and began running and hid behind the cars and trees. He literally went behind my tail and into the fenced land and apparently couldn't see me. I could see his feet from under the car and was about to burst into tears when he left and drove off. I didn't go back to my apartment, but I went to my neighbors and had their son accompany me into my house. That night, I cried and was shaking with fear all night long. Looking back now, I realized so many things that could have gone wrong. Him knowing where I lived and going out late at night in a not so safe area, and me being a small 5'2" teenager. That was really dumb on my behalf, but I'm glad that we moved shortly after. I'm a 17-year-old male, working a minimum wage job at a movie theatre. It's a small family-owned establishment in Jersey, nothing like Regal Cinemas or AMC. It's just an okay neighborhood, but a lot seems to happen in the area of the township. So this happened on my very first day working there. I'm behind the register, learning how to ring up customers' food. My trainer leaves me to help a few customers, sensing I've got it down. Bad idea. A gentleman walks in, balding, and with what appears to be snot dripping from his nose. A lot of it. Greenish, shiny. And in his hand he had one of those probiotic milkshakes. He walks right up to me, completely ignoring the customer I'm with. Hey, look at me. I look around, and he's clearly speaking to me, and that's definitely not my name. I hope you're one moment, sir, I tell him. Clearly, he doesn't like my answer. I'm off my meds now. I ain't crazy, man. The guy gets more agitated, scowling at me, and I'm getting more and more uneasy, and none of my co-workers are in sight. I'm sorry, sir, I don't know you. If you keep calling me crazy, man, he interrupts, I'll take you behind the dumpster and break off your legs and your jaw and dump your ass in there. I know when you get off. Now, I'm clearly shaken, and the customer left, also disturbed. Thanks, man. But before I can even think of what to say or do, the guy walks off and starts smacking an arcade machine we have, trying to talk to a father and a child across the room. I hear him say something about meds, right as my trainer walks back in. I tell her the story, and she asks the man to leave. He seems hesitant, but he does as she asks. Needless to say, I didn't walk alone to my car after that shift. I was stationed in Europe, a very small, very sought-after duty assignment. Most of our small dorm was full of shift workers and such. We would do odd things like barbecues at 3 AM, or just walk to our buddies' rooms at odd hours to see if they were awake. It was normal. Well, I had a particular friend there. He was a great guy, normal, very quiet and reserved, but he really could be the life of the party as well. Everyone liked this dude. Well, one day, he suddenly was gone, and being a small tight-knit group, word travelled fast. Did you hear that Xavier's dad died? He was killed in a car accident, and he rushed home to be with his family. Oh man, not this guy. He was such a good guy, and we all felt really bad for him. Now this guy could party with the best of them, but if you paid attention, you'd notice how respectful he was on a day-to-day basis. And he was the only guy in the dorms I noticed quietly going to church on a regular basis. Not a Jesus freak at all, but I respected how he practiced his faith quietly and could still be cool with the guys. Well, needless to say, upon his return, he had quite a somber tone. No one suggests any partying or the like for a while, and he just seems to shuffle between work and the dorm for a few weeks. One night, or should I say one early morning, I happened to be enjoying a day off, but still maintaining my sleep schedule, and I heard a soft knock at my door. It was this guy. I invite him in, and it was the first chance I'd had to have a real heart-to-heart with him, since he'd got back, and after just a few minutes of pleasantries he said, "There's something I need to tell you, and I want your opinion." "Sure man, what's up?" And then he drops a bomb on me. "I just saw my dad." What? Here is what he described. He was laying in bed, wide awake, reading a book. He explained that he was facing the wall with his back to the door, and he was propped up in such a way that his right arm was holding the book, and his left arm was under his right arm for support, and that ultimately was tucked under his pillow. So as he lay there, with only the light of a desk lamp over his bed illuminating his book, from behind him, he feels a hand slide under his pillow and gently grasp his left hand. In shock, he quickly looks over to see his father standing there. When I asked him what went through his mind, he said that he was surprised, but didn't feel like it was an unworldly event, and they just stared at each other for a while. At this point, he'd instinctively let go of the hand, and his father was just standing next to his bed. Then he said he spoke to his father, and he said, "I'm sorry." And he told me that he asked his dad, "Why are you sorry?" And his father replied, "Because I didn't bring you flowers. I was supposed to bring you flowers." And he followed up with, "Why? Why are you supposed to bring me flowers?" His father replied, "Because you're going to die." This is the part that was messing him up, and for the rest of the time I knew him, he was never his happy-go-lucky self again. It's been about 25 years. I really should look him up. When I was 12, my mum took my cousin, who was 1 year younger than I, and my best friend at the time and I, shopping at a Walmart during the Christmas season. A little background. I was mature for my age, and frequently went places alone, like the movies or the mall, or wandered around the stores alone while my mum shopped, and had never had any issues before. So we all walked into the store, and us girls made a beeline for the holiday section while my mum did her shopping. They had this huge man-sized Santa and snowman figures that could dance and sing carols on display for sale. Well, Someone before us had moved the figures so they faced each other. When they sang and danced, their stomachs and pelvises smacked into each other. A dumb prank. They were turning on as we walked up, and I just remember standing there staring at these two stupid huge things singing and humping. As we watched, I heard a deep voice giggle and say, "Pretty funny, huh? Did you like watching that?" My cousin and I side-eyed each other and just stood there unsure of what to do. I knew he was being gross, but I was very young and still didn't know the specifics of sex yet. It ended and he asked, "Do you want to watch it again?" I said no, grabbed her hand, and we left the section, and he didn't follow, or so I thought. We ended up in the toy section looking at Barbies. I felt someone looking at me, so I glanced up at the creepy man from the Christmas department at the end of the aisle staring at us. Suddenly he's walking towards me, and I remember my body going cold, and I grabbed my cousin's hand. "Come on, we have to go," I said, yanking her arm hard. She was completely oblivious to the guy and said, "No," while stomping her foot down. I dug my nails into her arm and she finally looked up and saw him coming towards us and let me pull her away. The creepy guy followed us out at the aisle. As we were walking away, he said, "Little bitch," to me, and his face was very angry. We ran through the store until we reached my mum, and I remember she was in the craft department. I think we told her we saw a creepy guy, but not that he had followed us around or yelled at us. To this day, I don't know why I downplayed it to her. Maybe for fear that I would lose some freedom. I hope to not meet that Christmas pervert again. I was in the army. It was pitch black. Me and my battle buddy had guard duty at Checkpoint Charlie. We were in a forest in a temporary camp. The time was around 1 AM, and while I was looking through our night vision equipment, I could see what resembled 4 people trying to crawl into our encampment. I follow protocol and call up our guard commander, who tells me there shouldn't be anyone out there, but to keep observing them and report back. We were on a drill, and there weren't planned situations this night. I give the night vision to my buddy, and he sees the exact same. 4 shapes crawling very, very slowly in the direction of our trenches. So next step is to stop them. I update my guard commander about the situation and what I intend to do. I then get up out of our trench and go to the edge of the camp with my rifle drawn and shout at them to stand up with their hands above their heads and to identify themselves. There's no response. My buddy is looking through the night vision the entire time and confirms to me that there is indeed someone out there. My guard commander comes running down with his pistol drawn, looking through the night vision goggles that he himself had. He confirms what I see, and the second he runs out there in anger to kick the crap out of them, they're gone. They didn't get up running, they just weren't there anymore. I can't for the life of me explain how, what, and why. When I was in high school, I lived in New York City. I went to a school on the Upper West Side, but I lived in East Midtown. It was a long trek on the subway back to my neighborhood, so every once in a while my parents would let me take a cab. One day, I was feeling particularly awful. I think I ended up coming down with the flu. My parents were forcing me to go to a therapy appointment. We never got along well, and this was their solution. Even though I was sick, I decided to take a cab from school to the office. I was probably about 16. I was never a pretty girl in high school. I usually wore a hoodie and jeans, and I was looking particularly gross this day due to feeling awful, and I know I was snorting all over myself. I got in the cab, and the cab driver started talking to me, which I usually didn't mind that day, but I didn't feel like talking. He asked me some typical stuff, like my name and where I was from. Then he started asking deeper questions. We were only halfway through the ride and I was starting to feel really skeeved out. He asked me if I had a boyfriend. He kept looking at me in the rearview mirror. He then asked me if anyone was waiting for me where I was going. I was feeling really sick at this point and not using my best judgment, so I said no to the boyfriend comment, but was smart enough to say yes to the second. He then asked for my number, and I told him I didn't have a cell phone. And of course, a few minutes later, it rang, and he looked at me with this god-awful smile on his face. I wanted to escape the cab, but I was afraid if I told him to pull over, he'd speed off with me in the cab. We got close to my destination, and we were stuck in some traffic. I told him to let me out here because I was going to be late. He locked the door and refused. I panicked. He was using words like baby and sweetie to refer to me. I should have just called 911, but I didn't think of it in my state of mind. But somehow, he must have decided against whatever he was doing. We reached a corner. He unlocked the doors. I threw money at him and ran out. I didn't even get his plates. I just wanted to get away. I'm 26 now, and so scared to think what actually might have happened. I've read some of the stories on here, and hadn't thought of it in years. Be careful when you get a cab. You never know what could go wrong. Back around 6 or 7 years ago, my mum had a boyfriend. My parents were divorced. His name was Dave. He was really chill and brought me graphic t-shirts and toys, but we never bonded to the point where I would consider him a good friend of mine. I only saw him a few times a week, and only when he was with my mum. Long story short, Dave and my mum didn't last more than a few months, and Dave and I didn't stay in contact. When I asked my mum why they weren't together anymore, she then told me that Dave was too crazy for her. It would be a few weeks later that I would realize just how crazy this guy was. I remember distinctly that Dave would show up to my house uninvited on multiple occasions, bringing my mum gifts and begging her to take him back. Every time he did this, he was shooed off our property. But it didn't stop there. Dave started showing up at my mum's work, mailing things to us, and being even more of a general creep. This went on for some weeks until eventually, one way or another, it stopped. About a year ago, my mum told me some information that she wanted to withhold from me when I was younger. After being silent for a while, Dave had found out information about my dad, where he worked and his name, and gave the company a call. But unfortunately, it was my dad who answered him. Dave's call was unexpected, as my dad knew nothing about this man who claimed to be my mother's boyfriend, even after they'd broken up. He asked my dad for information about me, like where I was currently and if I was busy. When my dad asked why, Dave said he wanted to take me to the amusement park, just me and him. Thankfully, my dad found it sketchy and hung up, and told my mum about it. Being my mother, she was shocked and terrified someone who had been practically stalking us had tried to weasel his way through my family to take me somewhere fun. To this day, I still don't know what his real intentions were with me, and I don't like to think about it. I was performing in a play at my local community theatre. Before the play starts, or towards the end of an intermission, it's normal for someone on the stage crew, usually the stage manager or assistant director, to periodically poke their heads into the dressing rooms to let everyone know how long they have left until curtain up. The venue I perform with only has one dressing room, so both boys and girls use it at the same time. Meh, it's a theatre. We're all sitting around chatting, when the guy opens the door and does the call. So, one of the guys thought somebody was using one of the two bathrooms in there, and one was obviously empty. He knocks on the door and says, 2 minutes. At least 5 of us, me and the guy that knocked, and maybe 3 others, heard a female voice from inside clearly say, "Thank you." After about 30 more seconds, when no one came out, he knocked again and opened the door, and there wasn't anyone in there. There were no windows in that bathroom, and only one door opening into the dressing room. We were all standing there. The voice definitely had the echoing, muffled quality that you'd expect to hear from someone in a bathroom, and the guy that knocked insisted he heard it coming from inside. Not only was he right next to me and the door, but he's not the type of person to believe in paranormal occurrences. We're all in the Navy, and I used to be stationed at Offord AFB. Some friends of mine were Navy MAs and Air Force security forces, and told me that they used to have to patrol this building that once housed ordnance. I heard all kinds of stuff about that place. One guy told me he saw a person in a flight suit just casually walking through an intersection between 2 corridors. He called out to them and ran to see where they were going, and of course when he looked around the corner there was no one there. Another buddy told me he took a couple of people down there because of all the stories they had heard. According to him, there was a constant banging on the pipes that seemed to follow them everywhere they went. Automatic toilets flushed whenever they got near one particular bathroom. And creepiest of all was this furnace room he described to me. He said the furnace had old, chipped paint on it, and the room smelled like sulfur. While they were standing there, a particularly loud bang on the pipes above them gave them all enough inspiration to leave. In university, I worked a summer job at an old small-town theatre. It was a bit of a tourist attraction, and like many theatres, there were ghost stories attached to it. This theatre has even been featured in a couple of ghost stories, books, and TV shows. I had spent months of my life in this building and never experienced anything. So, I just took it for bullshit, like most theatre superstitions. In the mornings when I would go to work, I'd come in through the main lobby doors and then walk down the seating aisle of the theatre towards the stage of the stairwell that led to the basement where the dressing rooms and offices were. I never bothered to turn the lights on despite the room being very dark. There were no windows and there was only ambient glow from the exit signs. I knew the path, and having worked in dark theatres for years, I have pretty good night vision. One morning, I walk in the door, and I'm about to step into the theatre, and for some reason I just couldn't do it. I was suddenly terrified to walk into the room. Just looking into the dark gave me goosebumps, and I felt like I would cry. I couldn't explain it. I ended up turning on every single light in the theatre before I would even step foot in it. This became my new habit for the rest of my time I worked there. I am currently living in the Middle East. One night, I decided to go more strolling and watch a movie with a friend of mine. We stayed there for quite a few hours and didn't realize it was already late. We had parted ways. She went home first and I was still waiting for the cab I booked. When the driver came, he was perfectly fine. Nothing sketchy, or so I thought. He was just quite annoying. He was asking too much, asking question upon question. What my name was, where I was originally from, how long was I staying abroad for, where and what was my work, if I have kids or a significant other. It felt inappropriate, so I refused to answer some of them. I just nervously laughed to signal I was getting uncomfortable, but he kept throwing questions at me. I didn't have the heart to tell him to stop asking, or to let him know it was making me feel uncomfortable. So I messaged my friend to call me. We have this safe word we say to each other if we need help exiting from a horrible person, conversation, or situation. And so she called. We were talking already, but he was still murmuring some stuff. A few seconds later, he turned on the radio and put the volume up, loud enough for me to barely understand my friend. This is when I got really scared. And then he began holding my other hand, like that scene from Titanic when Jack was intertwining his fingers with roses. And then, my mind suddenly shut down. I froze and didn't know what to do. And then I finally heard on the other line, "Hello, are you still alive?" I came to my senses and shouted, "Let me go." He said, "No." I told him I was going to call the police if he didn't, and so he stopped and dropped me off somewhere still far from home at 12 a.m. I called my sister to come pick me up. When we reached home, I was so thankful I was alive. For 1 second I thought I was breathing my last set of breaths. So to the cab driver, I don't think I was overreacting, and your gestures were really weird. Not cool. Let's not meet again. This happened to my friend Josh about 4 years ago. Josh was working at our local movie theatre in a crummy little town. It was about 2 a.m. and he was cleaning up all the popcorn debris that was left behind from a midnight viewing. He's just texting me lazily as I was playing World of Warcraft at the time and was using his company to stay awake. And then I get a message that says something happened, and I didn't hear from him for about 40 minutes. When he gets back to me, he says that he was just clearing up some popcorn that someone spilled and picking up someone's little cup when he heard a little giggle behind him. It sounded like a young child, definitely female. He turned around, creeped out, as he knew there was no one there, and no one was there. The sound was now coming from the hallway, so down the stairs he plopped and peeked around the corner. No one was there. At that moment, he decided he'd had enough, went to speak with a co-worker, and cooled off for about 20 minutes before venturing back in. He didn't hear that girl again, but when he spoke with a manager the next day, it was common knowledge in that theatre that it is haunted by the ghost of a little girl, as allegedly, the site the movie theatre stands on used to be an old schoolhouse, where apparently some girls died. When I was 10 or 11, I got Skype, which was great because I got to see my friends when I couldn't hang out with them. One night I was on Skype with my friend, and her dad told her to give me his Skype. I didn't think anything of this because my parents never taught me about adults having bad intentions, and I also spent a lot of time at my mum's office with other adults. I felt normal and safe. I messaged this man who was about 40 years old and married at the time, and we talked a lot for a while. He would ask me things about my life, sort of easing his way into asking me the creepy stuff. He never let me video chat him, which I was always disappointed in. I never saw how creepy he could have been in many ways, even when he would ask me things about my relationship, and asked if I liked boys or girls. He even went as far as suggesting that he had a crush on me. He never outright said it though, but very heavily suggested it. At some point he just dropped all contact with me. I got kind of upset, but it didn't last because I had normal preteen things that girls do. The only time I got a bad feeling about him was when the guidance counselor at school asked me if I'd ever talked to him. I knew in my heart he would get in trouble if I said yes, but I didn't know why he would get in trouble. I told her he'd never spoken to me, and I later learned he was under investigation for exploiting other young girls. In January 2011, my then boyfriend and I flew to New York City for his 21st birthday. We were both excited. We'd never been overseas before as we're Australian, and were really looking forward to seeing the city. We arrive at JFK around 10:30. We were so exhausted. Our luggage seemed to take forever to get off the carousel. As we were waiting, we listened to the warnings over the loudspeakers that stated we were only to get into the yellow taxi cabs and not get into unmarked cars. We got our luggage and headed for the exits, where there were a few taxis and one guy in a driver's uniform who came up and asked if we wanted a ride. We say yes, and he takes my suitcase and starts heading across the crossing. At this point my stomach drops, because he walked past the taxis and continued into a dark car park across the road. We followed him cautiously, because he has my suitcase, but we start to say we're not interested and want to go back. He stops at a black BMW, and I say to him, "Sorry, but we're going to get a taxi." He turns, looks at me and says, "Don't worry, baby, I'm legit." At this I grabbed my bag, and we noped out of there and into a yellow taxi. The driver said to us, "Yeah, you were either almost mugged, taken, or something worse. You've got to be careful out there." I really hope to never meet anyone like that again. I am a journalist, and was told this doozy by a woman I interviewed for a true crime story. When this woman was a young girl, let's say 8, she started to come down the stairs at night to tell her father that there was a man in her closet. He tells her there's no such thing as the bogeyman and sends her back to bed. This happens on and off for a week. Finally, he gets frustrated and walks into her room and says, "I'll show you there's nothing in your closet." As he goes to open the door, it opens an inch and then he feels someone slam it shut. Turns out, there really was a man in her closet. This guy was a perv who would come into the house every night and stare at the girl from the closet while she slept. The dad kicked the shit out of him, and the perv went to prison for many years. I researched her story 20 years after this happened. The guy had just gotten out of jail, and no one could find him.